Close your eyes, take a slow, deep breath, and let the world you know begin to fall away. Imagine a night sky. Not the sky above your city, not the sky you can see from your window right now, with its handful of visible stars and the distant glow of lights along the horizon. Imagine a sky with no human lights anywhere on Earth. No cities, no roads, no fires, nothing made by any creature that thinks or plans or wonders about its own existence. Just darkness and stars and the slow turning of a world that has been turning for a very long time. Now imagine you are standing in that darkness. The ground beneath your feet is warm. The air around you is thick and alive with the sound of insects you have never heard before calling out in rhythms that have no name in any human language. Somewhere in the distance, something very large is moving through the forest. You can hear the weight of it in every step. The ground carries the vibration faintly, the way a drum carries sound not just through the air but through everything it touches. You're 200 million years in the past. Welcome to the Jurassic. If you're using this to fall asleep, that is exactly why it was made. So settle in. Let your body grow heavy. Let the ancient world take shape around you as you drift. Subscribe if you enjoy sleeping to stories like this. New prehistoric worlds arrive every week. The Jurassic period lasted 56 million years. Think about what that means. 56 million years. Every civilization that human beings have ever built, every language ever spoken, every empire that ever rose and fell, every technological leap from the first stone tool to the device you're listening to right now, all of that together adds up to perhaps 300,000 years of human presence on this planet. The Jurassic lasted nearly 200 times longer than that. It was not a moment. It was not even an era in the human sense of the word. It was a world. A complete self-contained world, full of creatures living and dying and evolving and going extinct, full of forests and oceans and mountains rising and rivers changing course, full of ordinary days and extraordinary transformations, most of which happened so slowly that no single creature alive at the time would ever have noticed. And yet in that long, slow world, some of the most extraordinary animals that have ever existed were going about their lives. Giants were walking the earth. The sky was being conquered by creatures that had no feathers, no beaks, no hollow bird bones, and yet flew with a grace that evolution would not match again for tens of millions of years. The oceans were warm and full of life in forms that no human eye has ever seen alive. And among the forests and plains and coastal swamps, the dinosaurs were not just surviving, they were thriving, diversifying, filling every ecological niche with bodies and behaviours so varied that even now, after 200 years of paleontological discovery, we are still finding new ways they surprised us. This is their story. The full, deep, strange, beautiful story of what the Jurassic actually was. Not just the famous names, not just the giants, but the whole world. The small and the large, the predators and the prey, the ones that flew and the ones that dove into ancient seas, the ones that were already, quietly, beginning the long journey toward the birds that will wake you up tomorrow morning. Let yourself settle. Let your breathing slow. This is a story that has waited 200 million years to be told. There is no rush. The Jurassic has all the time in the world. To truly understand the Jurassic, you need to understand what came before it. You need to stand at the end of the Triassic period, roughly 201 million years ago, and see what the world looked like at that particular moment in time. Because the Jurassic did not arrive into an empty stage. It arrived into the aftermath of a catastrophe. And understanding that catastrophe, understanding what it took from the world, and what it left behind, is the only way to understand why the Jurassic became what it was. The Triassic period had lasted approximately 50 million years. It was, in many ways, the recovery era. It followed the worst mass extinction in the history of complex life on Earth, the Permian-Triassic extinction event, which had killed somewhere between 90 and 96% of all marine species and roughly 70% of all land vertebrate species. The world that the Triassic inherited was devastated, simplified, emptied out. Ecological systems that had taken hundreds of millions of years to build had been stripped back to almost nothing, and the early Triassic was a world still in the process of figuring out what it wanted to be. Over the 50 million years of the Triassic, life slowly rebuilt. Ecosystems became more complex. new groups of animals evolved to fill the niches left empty by the Great Dying. And among those new groups there were the dinosaurs. They had appeared around 235 million years ago, early in the Middle Triassic, and for most of the Triassic they were not particularly important. They were small, they were marginal. They were one group among many, competing with other reptiles, with large mammal-like synapsids, with the formidable ruling reptiles called archosaurs that dominated both the large predator and large herbivore roles in most Triassic ecosystems. But then, at the very end of the Triassic, everything changed again. 201 million years ago, give or take a few 100,000 years, the Earth experienced another mass extinction event. Not as catastrophic as the Permian event, but still profound enough to reshape life entirely. This was the end Triassic extinction, and its cause was volcanic. A massive geological process called the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, or CAMP for short, was tearing apart the supercontinent of Pangaea along the line that would eventually become the Atlantic Ocean. As the continents began their slow separation, enormous volumes of molten rock forced their way up through the crust and flooded the surface with lava flows on a scale that is almost impossible to visualize. Picture what this looked like. Not a single volcano erupting dramatically in a column of fire and ash, but a series of vast crack systems in the Earth's crust, opening up and allowing lava to pour out sideways, covering hundreds of thousands of square miles of landscape with layer after layer of dark basaltic rock. The lava itself was destructive, but the real damage was in the gases. Carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide released in enormous quantities into the atmosphere. Global temperatures swinging wildly, first cooling as sulfur dioxide reflected sunlight, then warming dramatically as the carbon dioxide built up in the atmosphere and trapped heat. Ocean acidification, disruption of the carbon cycle, collapse of food webs. The end Triassic extinction killed roughly half of all species on Earth. In the oceans, coral reefs were devastated. Many groups of marine reptiles went extinct or were severely reduced. On land, the large crurotarsal archosaurs, those dominant predators and herbivores that had ruled Triassic ecosystems, were nearly wiped out. The etosaurs, the phytosaurs, the rauisuchians, the prosauropod dinosaurs that had briefly become some of the largest land animals of the late Triassic, many of them gone, or reduced to scattered survivors. And here is what makes this moment so significant. Here is the thing that matters most for the story we are about to tell. The end Triassic extinction created a vacancy, a massive, sprawling, continent-spanning vacancy in the ecological order. The large animal niches, the roles of apex predator and dominant herbivore, roles that had been occupied by archosaurs and synapsids and early dinosaurs for 50 million years, were suddenly dramatically emptied. Not everywhere, not all at once, but enough. There was space, there was room, there were empty forests and open plains and rivers without their top predators, ecosystems without their largest browsers, skies without their most formidable flyers, and the dinosaurs, the ones that had survived the extinction, were standing at the threshold of all of it. To understand who those survivors were, imagine the world at the very end of the Triassic, in the last few million years before the extinction. By this point, dinosaurs had already diversified somewhat from their small, marginal beginnings. They had spread across most of Pangaea. They had already divided into the major lineages that would come to define them. The ornithischians, the bird-hipped dinosaurs that would eventually give rise to Stegosaurus and Triceratops, and the duck-billed hadrosaurs. The sauropodomorphs, which included the prosauropods, and the early forms of what would become the enormous long-necked giants of the Jurassic. And the theropods, the two-legged predators that would diversify into everything from the smallest feathered insectivores to Tyrannosaurus rex, and that would ultimately give rise to all modern birds. But in the late Triassic, none of these groups had yet reached their full potential. The sauropodomorphs were present, but not yet enormous. The largest were animals like Plateosaurus, perhaps 30 feet long, respectable, but not yet in the league of the true giants that were coming. The theropods included forms like Coelophysis, slender, fast, probably social, living in what is now the American Southwest in considerable numbers, a capable predator but not yet approaching the size of the creatures that would follow. The late Triassic world had also seen the first experiments in a variety of ecological strategies that the Jurassic would refine and perfect. Some dinosaurs were already showing signs of gregarious behavior, traveling in groups, possibly nesting communally. Some were already developing specializations in diet, with teeth and jaws beginning to diverge from the generalist designs of the earliest dinosaurs toward more specialized tools for processing different kinds of food. The basic dinosaur body plan, upright stance, hollow bones, relatively high metabolism compared to most other reptiles, was already demonstrating its flexibility. But there was one other thing about the late Triassic world that matters enormously for the story of the Jurassic, and that is the geography. Because Pangaea, that enormous supercontinent that had dominated Earth's surface since the Permian, was beginning to break apart. The process was slow by any human measure. We are talking about centimetres per year, the pace of fingernail growth. But over millions of years, centimetres per year becomes hundreds of miles of separation, and the consequences of that separation are enormous. As Pangaea began to rift along what would become the central Atlantic, new shallow seaways began to form between the separating landmasses. The geography of the world was changing. Climate patterns that had been driven by one enormous continent were being replaced by climate patterns driven by smaller, more separated landmasses. Ocean circulation was beginning to shift. The interior deserts that had dominated much of Pangaea were beginning to yield to different conditions in different regions, as the formerly unified supercontinent broke into distinct pieces. All of this was happening slowly, too slowly for any individual animal to perceive. But in geological time, it was happening fast, and it was creating a new world, a world with more diverse climates, a world with more varied ecosystems, a world with more opportunities for isolation and speciation, for populations to be cut off from each other and evolve independently into new forms. A world, in other words, that was ideally suited for the evolutionary explosion that was about to happen. When the end Triassic extinction struck, it removed the gatekeepers. It cleared out the dominant groups that had been occupying the most important ecological niches. And the dinosaurs that survived, already equipped with a body plan of remarkable flexibility, already beginning to diversify into the major lineages that would define them, already spreading across a world in the process of geographic transformation, found themselves inheritors of an empty empire. The last thing to understand about the world the Jurassic inherited from the Triassic is the quality of the silence that followed the extinction. In the fossil record you can actually see it. Rock layers from the very beginning of the Jurassic, the earliest Tangian stage, show dramatically reduced diversity compared to just before the extinction. Fewer species, simpler ecosystems, less complexity, less specialization, less ecological stratification. It is a world that has been stripped back and is beginning again. And then, slowly, layer by layer in the rock record, things begin to fill in. New species appear. Diversity increases. Complexity returns. The ecosystems of the Jurassic are being assembled from the survivors, one species at a time, one adaptation at a time, across thousands of generations and millions of years. That process of assembly, that rebuilding of a world from the ground up, is where the Jurassic truly begins. Breathe slowly. Let yourself feel the weight of all that time. There is no urgency in these ancient stories. They have already happened. They are already complete. You can simply rest here, at the threshold of the Jurassic, and watch the world begin to fill in. The early Jurassic lasted from approximately 201 million years ago to around 175 million years ago. 26 million years. More than enough time for a world to rebuild itself. More than enough time for ecosystems to move from the simplified post-extinction state to something richer, more layered, more alive. And that is exactly what happened. But it didn't happen all at once. The very earliest Jurassic, the first few million years, was still a world in recovery mode, survival mode. The catastrophic volcanism of the camp eruptions had not yet fully quieted. The atmosphere still carried elevated levels of carbon dioxide. Global temperatures were warmer than they are today, perhaps 5 to 10 degrees warmer on average, and the distribution of heat across the planet was different from what we know. There were no polar ice caps. The poles were temperate, even warm. The tropics were hot, intensely hot, and conditions there may have been too extreme for many species to thrive. The most hospitable climates in the earliest Jurassic existed at the mid-latitudes, the regions that would eventually become Europe and parts of North America and Asia. The oceans were still recovering from the acidification and warming that had accompanied the end Triassic event. Marine diversity was low. The elaborate reef ecosystems that had characterized parts of the Triassic were gone, replaced by simpler communities dominated by organisms that could tolerate the disrupted conditions. The shallow warm seas that were beginning to form as Pangaea rifted were gradually accumulating new diversity, but it was a slow process. The ocean was rebuilding itself from a simplified starting point, just as the land was. On land, the flora of the early Jurassic was dominated by plants that had survived the extinction event. Ferns and horsetails covered vast areas, filling in the ground layer of recovering forests. Conifers, which had diversified during the Late Triassic and had been among the survivors of the end Triassic extinction, were expanding their range. Cycads, those ancient seed plants with their distinctive crown of palm-like fronds, were widespread and diverse. Ginkgos, related to the single ginkgo species that survives today as what scientists call a living fossil, were present across much of the northern hemisphere. These were not flowering plants. Flowers did not exist yet. They would not evolve for another 100 million years. The Jurassic world was green and lush in many regions, but it was green and lush without colour, in the way we associate with life today. No wildflowers, no grass, no blossoming trees. The beauty of the Jurassic landscape was a beauty of texture and shadow, of ferns catching morning light, of ancient cycad fronds moving in warm wind, of conifer canopies creating a layered world of light and dark. Now imagine standing in this landscape. Imagine the quality of early morning in an early Jurassic forest. The air is warm and humid. There is a smell to it that is difficult to describe, earthy and resinous, the smell of living wood and wet soil and ancient leaf litter. The forest floor is soft under your feet, deep with moss and fern, and the light comes through the canopy in long slanted columns, dusty gold in the early hours. There are sounds, many sounds. Insects, because insects were abundant and diverse by this point in Earth's history, their various songs creating a constant background that rises and falls with the temperature of the day, and somewhere in that sound something larger, movement. The forest is not empty. It was never empty. Into this recovering world the dinosaurs began their expansion. The early Jurassic saw the first truly significant radiation of dinosaur diversity, the process by which a relatively small number of surviving lineages began to branch and diversify into the ecological niches left empty by the extinction. And the pace of that diversification was remarkable. Within the first 10 million years of the Jurassic, dinosaurs had already established themselves as the dominant large land animals across most of the world. The Ornithischian dinosaurs, those bird-hipped herbivores, were already present and beginning to diversify. Early forms like Lesothosaurus from southern Africa were small, fast, bipeds perhaps a metre or two in length, living on the ground and feeding on low-growing vegetation. They were not impressive by later standards, but they represented a beginning. From lineages like these, over millions of years of the Jurassic and into the Cretaceous, would come some of the most extraordinary herbivores that ever lived. The theropods were also diversifying rapidly. In the early Jurassic, the dominant theropods were Dilophosaurids, medium-sized predators of which the most famous is Dilophosaurus itself, known from fossils in what is now Arizona. Dilophosaurus was a significant animal by any measure. It reached lengths of about 20 feet, making it one of the largest predators of its time. It walked on two legs with a gait that paleontologists have described as both powerful and surprisingly graceful given its size. It had a distinctive pair of bony crests running along the top of its skull, thin and probably used for display rather than combat, and its jaws were lined with the sharp, recurved teeth of an active predator. What was it like to be in the presence of an animal like this? Think about the scale of it. 20 feet from nose to tail is longer than most living rooms. At the shoulder, it would have looked you directly in the eye. Its footsteps would have had weight, a deliberate rhythm as it moved through the forest, and there would have been a quality of attention in its movement, the focused, scanning quality of a predator whose senses were constantly evaluating its environment. It would have smelled things you could not smell. It would have heard things you could not hear. In many ways, it would have known the forest around it more intimately than you could have known it. The sauropodomorphs were the group that would define the Jurassic more than any other, and in the early Jurassic they were already beginning to show the direction their evolution was heading. The prosauropods of the late Triassic had been mostly bipedal or semi-bipedal animals, capable of rearing up on their hind legs to reach higher vegetation, but spending at least some time on all fours. By the early Jurassic, their descendants were shifting toward a more committed quadrupedal posture, their forelimbs becoming progressively more weight-bearing as their body sizes increased. The pressure to get bigger was already beginning to express itself. The reasons for this pressure are worth pausing on, because they tell us something fundamental about how the Jurassic world worked. Size in herbivores has a complex relationship with the plant communities available to them. A small herbivore can exploit a wide variety of plant resources, but is vulnerable to predators. A large herbivore has fewer predators to worry about, but requires enormous amounts of food to sustain itself, and is constrained in the variety of plant material it can efficiently process. There is a sweet spot, and the optimal size of that sweet spot depends on the density and distribution of plant resources in the environment. In the early Jurassic, as forests expanded and vegetation became more abundant, the energetic case for larger body size in herbivores became more compelling. An animal that could reach higher into the canopy, that could access vegetation unavailable to smaller competitors, that could travel long distances between resource patches because its sheer size made the energy cost of locomotion proportionally lower, that animal had advantages. And the sauropodomorphs were already beginning to exploit those advantages. By the time the early Jurassic gave way to the middle Jurassic, around 175 million years ago, the world had changed substantially from the post-extinction simplicity of the earliest Hitangian. Dinosaur diversity was genuinely impressive, spanning a range of body sizes, ecological roles, and geographic distributions. The oceans had recovered considerably, with new marine ecosystems developing in the shallow epicontinental seas that were expanding as Pangaea continued to break apart. Pterosaurs were diversifying in the skies, their lightweight bodies and membranous wings already demonstrating the astonishing versatility of a flight system, quite different from anything that had come before. The world was becoming something richer, stranger, more various than what had emerged from the Triassic extinction. Something that deserved its own name, something that we, looking back across a gulf of time that dwarfs everything in human experience, call the Jurassic. Breathe. Feel the weight of your body against whatever surface holds you. The world outside your window is built on layers upon layers of history, each one stranger and more beautiful than the last. The early Jurassic is 300 meters below you in the rocks, buried and silent and complete. Rest here for a moment. Let the ancient world settle around you like a warm, familiar darkness. There is a moment in the history of life on Earth that, if you could watch it in time-lapse, would look like a world deciding to try something it had never tried before. Something no previous ecosystem had ever attempted. Something so extreme, so energetically demanding, so structurally challenging, that most engineers studying it today still struggle to fully explain how it was possible. That moment is the rise of the sauropod dinosaurs. Sauropods were, simply put, the largest animals that have ever walked the surface of this planet. Not the largest animals overall. That distinction belongs to the blue whale, a creature of the deep ocean where the support of water reduces the engineering constraints of body size. But on land, on the open ground, where every gram of body weight has to be supported by the skeleton and moved by muscles powered by metabolic processes, no animal before or since has approached the scale of the great sauropods of the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods. We are talking about animals that weighed between 20 and 80 tons, animals that measured between 50 and 100 feet from nose to tail, animals whose necks alone were longer than most trees, whose tails counterbalance those necks across distances that are hard to visualize without standing next to a reconstructed skeleton and simply looking up. If you have ever done that, stood next to a mounted Brachiosaurus or Diplodocus in a natural history museum, you know the particular quality of awe that these animals inspire. It is not the awe of encountering something threatening. It is the awe of encountering something that simply should not be possible, and yet was. But we are getting slightly ahead of ourselves. Let us start at the beginning of the sauropod story, in the Middle Jurassic around 175 million years ago, when the true sauropods, as distinct from their prosauropod predecessors, were first establishing themselves as a significant ecological force. The transition from prosauropod to true sauropod was not a sudden event. It was a gradual process of anatomical refinement, each generation slightly larger than the last, each successive species showing incremental changes in the proportions of limb bones, the architecture of the vertebral column, the structure of the feet and hips, but the direction of change was clear and consistent. Bigger, always, inexorably bigger. By the Middle Jurassic, true sauropods had already achieved body sizes that dwarfed anything else walking on land. Forms like Shunosaurus from China, or the various cetiosaurid sauropods found across Europe and Africa, were already animals of truly impressive dimensions, reaching 30 to 50 feet in length and weighing several tons. But even these animals were only the beginning of the sauropod story. The key to understanding sauropod gigantism lies in a combination of anatomical and physiological innovations that, working together, made large body size not just possible but actively advantageous. And the first, and perhaps most important of these innovations, was in the skeleton itself. Sauropod vertebrae, particularly in the neck and back, were not solid bone. They were hollow. Riddled with air spaces and pneumatic cavities, connected to an elaborate system of air sacs that extended throughout the body, the vertebrae of sauropods were architectural wonders. They were strong enough to support the immense mechanical loads of a multi-ton body, while being light enough that the sheer mass of the skeleton did not become prohibitive. A solid-boned animal the size of a large sauropod would have been so heavy that its own skeleton might have been compromised under its weight. The pneumatized skeleton solved this problem elegantly. This same system of air sacs that lightened the skeleton also served another crucial function. It made breathing extraordinarily efficient. The sauropod respiratory system was not like a mammal system, where the same set of lungs both inhales fresh air and holds stale air in the process of gas exchange. It was more like a bird system, where air moves in one direction through the lungs, with separate chambers handling inhalation, gas exchange, and exhalation sequentially. This flow-through respiratory system meant that sauropod lungs were extracting oxygen from fresh, incoming air during every phase of the breathing cycle, making their respiratory efficiency dramatically higher than that of mammals or standard reptiles. And that efficiency mattered, because big bodies need a lot of oxygen. The metabolic demands of maintaining and moving a 40-ton body are extraordinary by any measure. A sauropod browsing through a Jurassic forest was burning energy at a rate that required both a highly efficient respiratory system and an enormous daily food intake. Which brings us to the question of what exactly sauropods were eating. Close your eyes again and imagine a late Jurassic forest, roughly 150 million years ago. The trees here are primarily conifers, tall and dense, their canopies forming a layered ceiling above the forest floor. Some reach heights of over 100 feet. Interspersed among them are cycads and tree ferns, and along the river margins dense stands of horsetails and primitive flowering plants in their earliest forms. The vegetation is abundant, incredibly abundant. The warm, wet climate of the late Jurassic has produced forests and floodplains covered with plants growing at rates that modern forests can barely match. Into this abundance moves a herd of sauropods, let us say Brachiosaurus, that most iconic of the large Jurassic sauropods, a genus known from fossils in both North America and Africa. An adult Brachiosaurus was roughly 80 to 90 feet long and may have weighed between 30 and 60 tons. Its front legs were longer than its back legs, giving it a distinctly giraffe-like slope to its body and allowing its neck to reach upward at a steep angle, extending the reach of its head to heights of perhaps 45 or 50 feet above the ground. Its head itself was relatively small, topped with a distinctive raised nasal crest, and its teeth were spoon-shaped, designed not for chewing but for stripping vegetation from branches and swallowing it whole to be processed by a large fermentation-based digestive system. A herd of Brachiosaurus moving through forest would have been an experience of overwhelming scale. The sound of them, first. Deep footsteps resonating through the ground felt as much as heard. The occasional low rumble of their vocalizations, because sauropods almost certainly communicated acoustically, though in frequencies we might struggle to perceive. The sound of vegetation being stripped from branches, a constant tearing, rustling backdrop punctuated by the heavy swallow of enormous quantities of plant material. And the smell. Large herbivores have distinctive smells, and sauropods would have been no exception. The warm, fermentation-rich scent of massive digestive systems processing enormous quantities of plant material. The earthy smell of their footprints, each one a depression in the soft Jurassic soil that other animals would use as water sources long after the herd had passed. The forest itself would have smelled different in their wake. the fresh wood exposed where branches had been stripped, the sap that oozed from those wounds, the crushed vegetation underfoot. Now consider the ecological impact of these animals. A single large sauropod would need to consume hundreds of pounds of vegetation per day to sustain itself. A herd of them moving through a landscape would strip sections of forest like a slow-moving tide. They would push over trees that were not worth the energy of stripping. They would create clearings that filled with lower-growing vegetation over subsequent decades, vegetation that fed other herbivores. Their footprints became temporary ponds. Their dung, deposited in enormous quantities, fertilized the soil and created patches of particularly rich plant growth. They were, in the truest ecological sense, ecosystem engineers. Different sauropod genera had different dietary strategies, a fact that allowed multiple large sauropod species to coexist in the same ecosystem without competing too directly. Diplodocus and its relatives, known from spectacular fossils in the Morrison Formation of the American West, had a very different neck architecture from Brachiosaurus. Their necks were long but held roughly horizontally, and their skull shape and tooth-wear pattern suggest they fed primarily at lower levels, perhaps browsing at forest edges or feeding on ground-level vegetation in open areas. Camarasaurus, another Morrison sauropod, had a more robust skull and teeth better suited for tougher plant material, possibly including cycad fronds or other more fibrous vegetation. This ecological partitioning, the process by which closely related animals in the same ecosystem avoid direct competition by specializing on slightly different resources, is one of the hallmarks of the Great Jurassic ecosystems. It is what made it possible for multiple giant sauropod species to live side by side in the same forest and floodplain systems, each one finding its niche within the broader abundance of the Jurassic plant world. There is something else about the sauropods that deserves quiet reflection as you lie here in the dark. Something that goes beyond their extraordinary size or their ecological impact or the sheer engineering marvel of their anatomy, and that is their success, the duration of their reign. Sauropods first appeared in the early Jurassic and went extinct with all non-avian dinosaurs 66 million years ago. That is a span of approximately 135 million years during which sauropods, in one form or another, existed on Earth. For comparison, our own genus, Homo, has existed for perhaps 3 million years. The entire family tree of primates, going back to the earliest protoprimate ancestors, is only about 85 million years old. Sauropods were here for 135 million years. They were here before primates existed, before flowering plants dominated the landscape, before the Atlantic Ocean was more than a narrow rift. They were still here when the asteroid struck. They were still here in some of the most extraordinary body forms they would ever achieve, right up until the very end of the Mesozoic. There is a kind of permanence in that fact that transcends ordinary human conceptions of time. The sauropods were not a brief experiment. They were not an anomaly. They were one of the most successful large animal body plans in the history of complex life on Earth. The Jurassic was their first great flourishing, but it was not their last. They would continue to diversify and adapt through the Cretaceous, producing new lineages, new body plans, new ecological strategies, right up until the world changed in a way that even they could not survive. But here, in the Jurassic, watching a herd of Brachiosaurus move through a forest that is itself beyond anything in the modern world, it is enough to simply acknowledge what they were. They were extraordinary, they were real, and for 135 million years the ground shook where they walked. Let that thought carry you. The slow, heavy rhythm of sauropod footsteps, felt through the earth, carrying through the soft ground beneath you, a vibration so deep it is more sensation than sound. Let it slow your breathing. Let it become the rhythm of rest. Every great ecosystem needs its predators, not as a moral fact, not as something we need to feel good about, but as an ecological one. Predators are the forces that shape prey populations, that prevent any single herbivore group from consuming all available vegetation, that maintain the complex balance of a functioning ecosystem by exerting selection pressure on the animals they hunt. Without predators, ecosystems simplify and destabilize. With them, they become richer, more diverse, more structurally complex. Predators are not the enemies of abundance. They are, in a very real sense, its guardians. And in the Jurassic, the predators were magnificent. The theropod dinosaurs, those two-legged carnivores that would eventually give rise to every bird alive today, were the dominant land predators of the Jurassic period across most of the world. They had been establishing themselves as significant predators since the early Jurassic, but it was in the late Jurassic, particularly in the famous ecosystems preserved in the Morrison Formation of North America and the Tendaguru Formation of what is now Tanzania, that they reached their first great peak of diversity and ecological dominance. The star of the Morrison Predator Guild, the animal that most completely embodied the role of apex predator in the late Jurassic of North America, was Allosaurus. Allosaurus was not the largest predatory dinosaur that ever lived. Tyrannosaurus rex, which lived 66 million years ago in the late Cretaceous, was substantially more massive, and there were Cretaceous-era giants like Spinosaurus and Carcharodontosaurus that matched or exceeded Allosaurus in length, if not necessarily in bulk. But in the context of its own time and place, in the late Jurassic floodplains of what would become Utah and Colorado and Wyoming, Allosaurus was the undisputed lord of the hunt. An adult Allosaurus reached lengths of between 30 and 40 feet, occasionally somewhat larger based on fragmentary remains of particularly impressive individuals. It weighed somewhere between 1.5 and 3 tons, though estimates vary. Its skull was large and deep, but unlike the massively reinforced skull of Tyrannosaurus with its bone-crushing bite, the Allosaurus skull was relatively lightly built, with large openings that reduced its weight without compromising its structural integrity. This has led paleontologists to suggest that Allosaurus may have used its jaws in a different way from the largest Cretaceous predators, perhaps striking with the upper jaw like a hatchet rather than biting down with a bone-crushing grip. A predator of ambush and slash, using speed and the cutting edge of its teeth rather than the brute force of its bite. Its arms were relatively substantial compared to the reduced forelimbs of Tyrannosaurus, equipped with 3-fingered hands bearing large curved claws that could have been used to grip prey or to hold a struggling animal while the jaws did their work. Its hind legs were long and powerful, designed for both sustained movement and the burst of speed needed for the final charge of a predatory attack. And its eyes faced partly forward, giving it a degree of binocular vision and depth perception that would have been useful for judging distances when lunging at prey. Imagine Allosaurus in its environment. The time is late afternoon in the late Jurassic, roughly 150 million years ago, somewhere in the floodplain system that would eventually become the American West. The light is long and golden, and the air is warm, carrying the smells of river mud and conifer resin and the distant, unmistakable sweetness of water. Near a bend in one of the seasonal rivers, a group of smaller dinosaurs has come to drink. A few Camptosaurus, medium-sized ornithopods, 5 or 6 feet high at the hip, standing cautiously at the water's edge with their heads up and their senses alert. And at the forest edge, still, in the deep shadow of the conifers, an Allosaurus is watching. This is the patient, calculating moment before action. The Allosaurus is not stupid. It is not simply a mechanism for converting prey into more Allosaurus. It has a brain that, while smaller relative to its body than a mammalian predator's brain, is organized around the same basic functions: threat assessment, opportunity evaluation, the calculation, made below the level of conscious thought in any animal without language, of whether the energy expended in a hunt is likely to be recovered by the energy gained from a successful kill. The Camptosaurus at the water's edge are nervous. They're always nervous. Being prey is a life of constant low-level alertness, punctuated by moments of acute terror. Their senses are not as powerful as the predator watching them. Their noses are good, but the wind is wrong. Their eyes see movement at great distances, but the Allosaurus has not moved. They do not know they are being watched. They lower their heads to drink. The Allosaurus moves. Not with explosive speed, not at first. A few careful steps out of the shadow. Then the assessment changes. Some threshold crossed in its nervous system, and the movement becomes committed. A full sprint, legs driving hard against the Jurassic soil, the earth shaking with each massive footfall, the sprint covering the distance in seconds. The Camptosaurus scatter. Some make it. One does not. This exchange, this ancient transaction between predator and prey, has been happening on Earth for hundreds of millions of years. It was happening in the Jurassic between Allosaurus and Camptosaurus. It was happening earlier, in different forms with different actors, through all the previous chapters of complex life. And something about it is worth holding in mind as you drift towards sleep, because it is a fundamental rhythm of the living world, as basic as the water cycle or the turning of the seasons. Life feeds on life. Death enables more life. The Jurassic was not a peaceful place, but it was a balanced one, and that balance sustained it for millions of years. Allosaurus was not the only predator in the Morrison ecosystem. The predator guild of the Late Jurassic was diverse, with different species filling different ecological roles within the broader predatory economy. Ceratosaurus, slightly smaller than Allosaurus and distinguished by the distinctive horn on its nose, was another significant predator, and its dental and limb proportions suggest it may have specialized in different prey or different hunting strategies, possibly pursuing prey into shallow water or specializing in different components of the available fauna. Torvosaurus, represented by large specimens from both North America and Europe, was if anything even larger than Allosaurus, a more robust, powerfully built animal that may have been capable of tackling the largest available prey. And then there were the small ones, the Coelurosaurs, the lightly built, fast-moving, relatively large-brained small theropods that seem, from our current vantage point, almost modest compared to the giants of their ecosystem. Ornitholestes, a small predator of perhaps 3 to 4 feet in length from the Morrison Formation. Scipionyx, known from an extraordinarily preserved juvenile specimen from Italy that actually preserved soft tissue, giving us a window into the internal anatomy of a small theropod. Various other small Coelurosaurs whose remains are fragmentary but whose presence in the fossil record is unmistakable. These small Coelurosaurs deserve more attention than they typically receive in popular accounts of Jurassic life, because they were not simply miniature versions of the large predators. They occupied genuinely different ecological niches, feeding on insects, small lizards, early mammals, and eggs. They were quick, agile, and almost certainly behaviorally sophisticated compared to their larger relatives. Some of them were almost certainly feathered. The fossil evidence for feathers in small Coelurosaurs by the late Jurassic is substantial, and the logic of their presence is compelling. Small animals lose heat faster than large ones. Insulation is valuable, and the transition from insulating feathers to flight-capable feathers is a transition that was, at some point in the Jurassic, beginning to be made. But we will return to that story. For now, let the world of Jurassic predators settle around you. The distant call of something hunting in the darkness of the Jurassic night, the stillness of the forest between hunts, the quiet that follows the storm of a predatory event when the landscape returns to its ordinary rhythms and the surviving animals slowly lower their heads to graze again. This is how the world works, has always worked, will always work. It is not comfortable, but it is not chaos either. It is order of a kind. Deep, ancient biological order that has been operating since long before the Jurassic and will go on operating long after every dinosaur is gone. Let it be a background for your rest, ancient and undisturbed. Now let us talk about the other great predators of the Jurassic, not on land, but in the air and in the sea. Because the theropods on land, spectacular as they were not the only predatory story the Jurassic had to tell. The skies of the Jurassic were ruled by pterosaurs, and the seas were ruled by reptiles of extraordinary diversity and power. But before we go there, let us take a moment to appreciate the diversity of the land predator guild beyond the headline species. Because the Morrison Formation and the other great Jurassic ecosystems we know best are rich in small and medium-sized predators that lived alongside the giants, each finding its particular way of making a living in a world of extraordinary abundance. Stegosaurus, the iconic plated dinosaur, was not a predator, of course, but its presence in the Morrison ecosystem tells us something important about the diversity of prey available to the large predators. Stegosaurus was a substantial animal, reaching lengths of up to 30 feet and weighing perhaps 4 to 7 tons. Its distinctive double row of bony plates along its back and the 4 sharp spikes at the end of its tail known as the thagomizer were both defensive structures and possibly thermoregulatory devices, though the thermoregulation hypothesis has become less favoured in recent years as evidence has accumulated. The tail spikes were formidable weapons. Fossil bones of Morrison-era predators, including Allosaurus, have been found bearing injuries consistent with stegosaur tail strikes, evidence that the hunted were not always passive victims. The ornithopods, including Camptosaurus and the smaller Dryosaurus, were the medium-sized herbivores of the Morrison, occupying a different dietary niche from the giant sauropods. Beefsteal runners capable of considerable speed, with teeth and jaw mechanics well suited for processing a variety of plant material, they were among the more mobile and behaviourally complex of the Morrison herbivores. Their relatively large eyes and alert forward-positioned posture suggest animals that were constantly aware of their environment, constantly evaluating the risk of predation in the context of the need to find food and water. This community of animals, this web of predators and prey and competitors and coexisters, is what made the Morrison Formation so remarkable. It was not just a collection of impressive individual species. It was a functioning ecosystem, with all the complexity and interdependence that implies. The giant sauropods were shaping the forest structure. The ornithopods were maintaining the lower brows. The predators were keeping everything in balance. The small coelurosaurs were harvesting the small prey that would otherwise have proliferated without check. Each species was connected to all the others in a web of relationships that sustained the whole, and it lasted. This Morrison ecosystem, or something like it, persisted for millions of years. Not unchanged, of course. Individual species came and went. Climate fluctuated. Sea levels rose and fell. The river systems of the Morrison floodplains shifted their courses over time, creating new habitats and eliminating old ones. But the basic structure, the community of giant sauropods and diverse ornithischians and medium to large theropods and small coelurosaurs, that structure was stable across millions of years of Jurassic time. That stability is worth contemplating as you drift toward rest. The world you are lying in is a world of change, of constant rapid transformation on human timescales. But measured against the Jurassic, measured against 50 million years of relative ecological continuity, it is almost impossibly brief. The Morrison ecosystem lasted longer as a stable community than the entire geological history of the Himalayan mountains. Longer than the time since the last major ice age by a factor of more than 10. The Jurassic was not a world in crisis. It was a world at home in itself, comfortable and vast and enduring in ways that our brief human moment makes difficult to fully imagine. Rest in that endurance, the slow, heavy rhythm of that ancient world. The Jurassic does not hurry. It never did. To know the Jurassic fully, you cannot keep your eyes on the land. You must look up and look down. You must look up into a sky that was crossed by creatures nothing like modern birds, moving through the warm Jurassic air on wings that worked on principles both similar to and different from everything that came after. And you must look down into the warm, shallow seas that were spreading across the breaking continents of the ancient world, into water that was alive with animals of extraordinary grace and power. Let us begin with the sky. The pterosaurs were not dinosaurs. This distinction matters, though it can be confusing, because pterosaurs and dinosaurs were closely related, both belonging to the broader group called archosaurs, both tracing their ancestry back to common ancestors in the Triassic. But dinosaurs and pterosaurs had been evolving on separate lineages since at least the Middle Triassic, and by the time of the Jurassic they were as distinct from each other as, say, horses are from elephants. The pterosaur body plan was uniquely and specifically adapted for powered flight, in a way that the dinosaur body plan was not. They were not flying dinosaurs. They were the other great success story of the archosaur lineage. The pterosaur wing was a membrane, not a feathered wing like a bird's, not a leathery gliding surface like a flying squirrel's, but an intricate fibrous muscular membrane stretched between the enormously elongated fourth finger of the hand and the hind leg, supported by internal fibres called actinofibrils that gave the wing both strength and a degree of active shape control. This was not a passive sail. It was an active aerodynamic surface that the pterosaur could deform and adjust in flight, controlling its angle of attack, its camber, its overall geometry to manage lift and drag in response to changing conditions. The sophistication of pterosaur flight mechanics is only now being fully appreciated, as researchers combine fossil evidence with computational fluid dynamics to understand how these extraordinary animals actually moved through the air. The early Jurassic pterosaurs were the ramphorhynchoids, the long-tailed forms that represented the more ancestral pterosaur body plan. Animals like Dimorphodon, known from the early Jurassic of England, were relatively small creatures with distinctive large puffin-like heads and long diamond-tipped tails. Their wings spanned perhaps 4 feet, making them roughly the size of a large modern seabird. They would have been agile flyers, probably capable of both sustained soaring in favourable conditions and rapid manoeuvring when hunting or avoiding threats. By the Middle and Late Jurassic, pterosaur diversity had increased substantially, and the group was already showing the experimental diversity that would eventually produce the enormous forms of the Cretaceous. Saurides, the so-called hairy devil from Kazakhstan, was known from a specimen that preserved evidence of a dense coat of hair-like or fibre-like structures called pycnofibers, providing strong evidence that pterosaurs were warm-blooded and insulated, active animals rather than cold-blooded reptiles dependent on external heat. Rhamphorhynchus, one of the most beautifully preserved pterosaurs known, was a fish-eating specialist from the late Jurassic of Germany and Tanzania, with long, forward-pointing teeth perfect for snagging fish from the surface of the sea, and a rigid tail that probably served as a stabilizer during the fast, diving approach to prey. Imagine a late Jurassic coastline. The time is midday, and the light is intense and white on the water. The sea here is warm and shallow, an epicontinental sea spreading across the interior of a slowly separating Pangaea, and the water is clear, turquoise where it is shallow over pale limestone seafloor, deepening to indigo in the channels between limestone islands. On the wind, which is steady and warm from the south, there are pterosaurs, dozens of them, working the air above the water, their wingspans ranging from the small insectivores no bigger than a modern swallow to the larger fish-eaters with wingspans of 5 or 6 feet that cruise the surface in long tilting arcs, eyes scanning the water below. A Rhamphorhynchus spots something, a fish perhaps a metre or 2 below the surface, a shimmer of silver visible through clear water. The pterosaur tips forward into a shallow dive, wings folding slightly to reduce drag, the angle precise, and then at the last moment the wings flare open again, breaking the dive, the long-toothed jaws dipping below the surface for a fraction of a second, and it is airborne again with a small struggling fish crosswise in its jaws. The whole operation took less than 2 seconds. This is skill. This is the product of millions of years of evolution, of generation after generation of selection for the precise neuromuscular coordination needed to perform this maneuver. The Rhamphorhynchus has no thought of its own expertise. It is simply hungry, and it has the body to satisfy that hunger with extraordinary grace. Now look down, into the water beneath those pterosaurs, into the Jurassic Sea. The Jurassic oceans were among the most biologically diverse in Earth's history. The shallow epicontinental seas that spread across what is now Europe and parts of North America and Africa were warm, well oxygenated and rich in nutrients, supporting elaborate food webs from the smallest plankton to enormous apex predators. The famous Solnhofen Lagoon of what is now Bavaria, from which Archaeopteryx and dozens of other extraordinary fossils are known, was one small corner of a much larger shallow sea system that covered much of what is now Central Europe during the late Jurassic. The marine reptile fauna of the Jurassic was dominated by 2 major groups, the ichthyosaurs and the plesiosaurs, with a third group, the marine crocodiles, playing an important supporting role. The ichthyosaurs were among the most extreme examples of convergent evolution in the history of life. They had evolved from terrestrial ancestors in the Triassic, gradually adapting to an aquatic lifestyle over millions of years, and by the Jurassic they had arrived at a body form strikingly similar to that of modern dolphins and tuna. Streamlined fusiform bodies, large powerful tail flukes used for propulsion, stabilizing fins, large eyes, often the largest relative to body size of any vertebrate known, adapted for seeing in deep or murky water. The convergence with modern fish and marine mammals is so complete that it serves as one of the most often cited examples in all of biology of evolution, finding the same solutions to the same problems when the problems are the same. The most familiar Jurassic ichthyosaur is Ophthalmosaurus, named for its extraordinarily large eyes. An adult Ophthalmosaurus was perhaps 15 feet long, a streamlined, dolphin-like animal that was probably capable of diving to considerable depths in search of prey, primarily squid and fish. Its eyes were enormous, with a sclerotic ring of bone that may have helped them maintain their shape under the pressure of deep dives. In very deep water, where light is scarce and the pressure can distort softer tissues, large eyes and structural reinforcement are both adaptations for success in a challenging environment. What would it have been like to share the water with Ophthalmosaurus? Imagine you are somehow suspended in the warm blue of the Jurassic Sea, in 30 feet of water over a limestone seafloor scattered with crinoid stems and ammonite shells. The light above is dappled and shifting, refracted by the gentle surface waves. Below you, the limestone disappears into a deeper blue. The water is warm and clear enough that you can see 100 feet in every direction, and then the ichthyosaurs appear, not 1 but 6 or 8 of them, moving in loose formation, their streamlined bodies weaving with effortless efficiency through the water, their tail flukes driving them forward with the smooth power of animals perfectly adapted to this medium. Their eyes, each one larger than your fist, scan the water continuously, missing nothing. They pass within 20 feet of you without apparent alarm. You are not prey. You are not a threat. In their calm, intelligent-seeming gaze, you are simply an object in the water, notable but not particularly interesting. They are beautiful. That is the word that keeps arriving regardless of how many others come before it. Beautiful in the way that perfect adaptation is always beautiful. Beautiful in the way that things that fit their world completely are always beautiful. The ichthyosaurs fit the Jurassic Sea the way a blade fits a sheath. Completely. Inevitably. The plesiosaurs were a different story. Where the ichthyosaurs had converged on the body form of fast, open-water pursuit predators, the plesiosaurs had evolved a body plan with no modern equivalent. Long necks, ranging from modest in the pliosaurs to extraordinarily extended in the true plesiosaurs. Short, broad bodies. 4 large flippers, used for propulsion in a style sometimes compared to flying underwater, all 4 limbs working together to generate thrust and maneuverability. Small heads in the long-necked forms, large heads with massive jaws in the short-necked pliosaurs. The Jurassic saw the plesiosaur body plan diversify extensively. Long-necked forms like Cryptoclydus and Muranosaurus were present in the epicontinental seas of Europe. The plesiosaurs, with their enormous skulls and powerful bite forces, were the apex predators of the deeper sea. Leopleurodon, the most famous Jurassic pliosaur, may have reached lengths of 20 feet or more, with a skull 3 feet long, equipped with enormous conical teeth designed for seizing large, struggling prey. It would have been one of the most formidable predators in the history of the ocean up to that point. The ocean of the Jurassic was not just reptiles, of course. The ammonites, those coiled cephalopods with chambered shells, were extraordinarily diverse, with dozens of species present in most marine deposits of the period. Fish, including early rays and sharks and a wide diversity of bony fish lineages, were abundant. And the reef-building organisms, though not the coral-dominated reefs of today, were present and building complex 3-dimensional structures that provided habitat for an enormous variety of smaller organisms. The Jurassic Sea was a world as rich and complex as the Jurassic Land, and in many ways even more alien. A world of warm, clear water and limestone floors and ammonite shells spiralling in the current, of ichthyosaurs hunting in the middle depths and plesiosaurs ruling the deep, of pterosaurs skimming the surface and leaving brief ripples where their teeth touched the water. A world that lasted for millions of years and left its record in the limestone formations of Bavaria and England and Tanzania and dozens of other places around the world. A world that was real as the one you are lying in right now, with its own light and sound and smell, and the quiet, continuous business of living things going about their lives. Let the image of that ancient ocean settle around you. The quality of light in warm, clear water, the slow, powerful movements of large animals in their element, the quiet of deep water, which is not silence but something fuller than silence, a presence rather than an absence. Let it carry you toward rest. There is a principle in evolutionary biology that goes something like this. The most significant transformations are often the quietest. The most important evolutionary transitions are frequently invisible at the time they occur, hidden in the biology of small, unobtrusive animals that attract little attention from the large predators and the dominant ecosystem players of their era. The future can be impossible to see from inside the present, and nowhere in the history of life is this principle better illustrated than in the story of how dinosaurs became birds. Because they did. Every bird alive today, from the tiny hummingbird hovering in a garden to the wandering albatross cruising 10,000 miles of open ocean on 7-foot wings, is a dinosaur. Not descended from dinosaurs in a general ancestral sense, not distantly related to dinosaurs through some common reptilian ancestor, but genuinely, taxonomically, scientifically a dinosaur. Birds are theropod dinosaurs. They are members of the group Dinosauria as definitively as Tyrannosaurus rex or Brachiosaurus or Triceratops. When the asteroid struck 66 million years ago, and the non-avian dinosaurs went extinct, the avian dinosaurs, the birds, survived. The dinosaurs did not go extinct. They are outside your window right now. This is one of the most profound reframings in the history of natural science, and it came about through the accumulation of fossil evidence that was gradually, over the course of the 20th century, building a picture of small, feathered bird-like dinosaurs in the Jurassic and Cretaceous that made the dinosaur-bird connection undeniable. The story of how birds evolved begins, as so many evolutionary stories do, not with a single dramatic moment of transformation, but with a series of gradual changes accumulated over millions of years in small, unobtrusive animals that no one at the time would have recognized as particularly significant. The small coelurosaur theropods of the Jurassic were the group from which birds eventually emerged. They were present from the beginning of the period, and through the Jurassic they were diversifying quietly, while the large predators attracted attention and the giant sauropods dominated the landscape. Animals like Ornitholestes from the Morrison Formation. Small, fast, probably feathered, feeding on insects and small lizards and perhaps stealing eggs when the opportunity arose. Animals like Scipionyx from Italy, the extraordinarily preserved juvenile whose fossilized soft tissues give us a glimpse of the internal plumbing of a small coelurosaur. Animals from China, particularly from the deposits of Liaoning province, that would eventually yield the most spectacular evidence of feathered dinosaurs ever discovered, though most of those Chinese finds come from the Cretaceous rather than the Jurassic. But the pivot point of the whole story, the fossil that first crystallized the dinosaur-bird connection, in the minds of scientists and the public alike, comes from the Late Jurassic, and it comes from one of the most remarkable rock formations in the world. The Solnhofen limestone of Bavaria in southern Germany was deposited in a shallow, calm lagoon environment approximately 150 million years ago, during the Late Jurassic. The conditions in this lagoon were unusual. The water was warm and very saline, and at certain depths it may have been largely anoxic, lacking sufficient oxygen to support most forms of life. These conditions made it a death trap for animals that fell into it, or were washed in by currents, but they also made it an extraordinary preservation environment. Animals that sank to the bottom were not scavenged, because nothing could survive at the bottom long enough to eat them. They were not disturbed by bioturbation, the churning of sediment by burrowing organisms, because no burrowing organisms lived in the oxygen-free depths. They simply sank, settled, and were buried in fine limestone mud that preserved them in extraordinary detail. The Solnhofen has given us some of the most spectacular fossils known to science. Perfectly preserved jellyfish, horseshoe crabs that left tracks showing exactly how they moved across the seafloor before dying, pterosaurs with wing membrane detail visible, fish with scales and fins intact, and most famously of all, Archaeopteryx. Archaeopteryx is the most famous fossil in the world. That is not a casual statement. In terms of its cultural and scientific significance, in terms of the number of times it has been depicted and described, and argued over and held up as evidence of evolutionary processes, no fossil rivals it. 12 specimens are known, all from the Solnhofen limestone, and together they have shaped our understanding of the dinosaur-bird transition more than any other evidence. An Archaeopteryx was roughly the size of a modern crow. It had feathers. Not just body feathers for insulation, but proper flight feathers, asymmetric veins attached to the wing bones in exactly the arrangement seen in modern flying birds. Its feathered tail spread behind it like a small fan. Its feathers were probably black, based on the melanosomes preserved in the most recently analysed specimens. But it was not just a bird. It retained a remarkable mix of features that speak to its position as a transitional form between non-avian dinosaurs and modern birds. It had teeth, where modern birds have beaks. It had 3 free-clawed fingers on its wings, where modern birdwing fingers are fused and reduced. It had a long, bony tail, where modern birds have a fused tailbone called the pagostyle. Its shoulder joint was oriented differently from most modern birds, which has implications for the kind of flight strokes it could generate. And its feet, rather than being fully adapted for perching on branches like most modern birds, appear to have been adapted for ground running or climbing, with a prominent sickle-shaped claw on the second toe that is shared with many small non-avian theropods. It was, in the most literal sense of the word, both dinosaur and bird simultaneously. It was the living fossil of a transition that was still in progress. But here is something worth sitting with in the quiet of the night. Archaeopteryx was not the ancestor of modern birds. It was a cousin, a closely related but ultimately separate branch of the evolutionary tree that led to the birds we know today. The actual lineage leading to modern birds was evolving somewhere alongside Archaeopteryx, making its own slightly different set of transitions. and we have not yet found the key fossils from that lineage that date to the Jurassic. They exist, almost certainly. They are buried in rocks somewhere in China or Mongolia, or perhaps somewhere entirely unexpected, waiting for the paleontologist who will one day find them, but we have not found them yet. What we have is Archaeopteryx, and it is enough. More than enough. It is a window into the moment when the world of the Jurassic was quietly, invisibly, preparing the gift it would eventually give to the future. The gift of flight, the gift of birds, the gift of a lineage that would survive the end of the Mesozoic and carry the dinosaur legacy forward into a world transformed by ice and flowering plants, and eventually by the arrival of curious upright primates who would one day look up at the sky and wonder about the creatures that had once ruled it. The evolution of flight is one of the most contested questions in all of paleontology. Two broad hypotheses have dominated the debate. The trees down hypothesis, which proposes that the ancestors of birds were tree-climbing animals that evolved gliding as a first step, with true powered flight developing as an extension of gliding, and the ground-up hypothesis, which proposes that the ancestors of birds were fast-running ground animals, and that the proto-wings that eventually became true wings first functioned to improve running performance before being co-opted for flight. Both hypotheses have evidence for and against them. The truth may be some combination of both, or something else entirely that the existing evidence has not clearly revealed. What we know is that somewhere in the late Jurassic, in a lineage of small feathered coelurosaur dinosaurs, the threshold of powered flight was crossed. An animal became capable of sustained, controlled, powered flight through the air, and once that threshold was crossed, the possibilities expanded rapidly. Flight opens ecological niches that are simply inaccessible to ground-bound animals, access to food sources at height, the ability to escape predators in 3 dimensions rather than 2, the possibility of covering enormous distances with relatively low energy expenditure compared to walking. Flight was not just a neat trick, it was a fundamentally new way of being in the world. The small feathered dinosaurs of the Jurassic, working their way through the insect-rich understory of Jurassic forests, climbing the conifer trees in search of eggs and lizards, spreading their arms for balance as they leapt between branches, were unknowingly making preparations for one of the most consequential innovations in the history of life. They did not know they were beginning a journey that would end with 10,000 species of birds filling every terrestrial and coastal habitat on Earth. They were just trying to eat and avoid being eaten, generation after generation after generation. That is how evolution works. Patient, purposeless, powerful. Millions of small decisions made by millions of individual organisms, each pursuing nothing more than survival and reproduction, and the cumulative result of all those small decisions viewed across deep time is something that looks like purpose, something that looks like progress, something that feels, in the contemplative quiet of a night 200 million years later, like a story worth telling. Let yourself be small for a moment. Let yourself be a small feathered animal in the canopy of a Jurassic forest, the resin smell of conifers around you, the sound of rain on the canopy above, the forest floor far below and dimly visible through layers of branches and ferns. The night is coming on. The last light is filtering through the trees from the west, turning the needles gold. You tuck your head under your wing. The forest breathes around you. Everything is ancient and still and complete. There is a place in the American West stretching across parts of Utah and Colorado and Wyoming and Montana and several other states, where the Earth tells a story in stone that is unlike any other story preserved in rock anywhere on the planet. It is a story written in the colours of rust and cream and pale green, in the distinctive banded cliff faces that have made the landscapes of the Colorado Plateau famous across the world. It is a story written in bone, in the fossilised remains of animals so large and so strange that when the first scientific expeditions found them in the 1870s, the discovery triggered one of the most intense episodes of competitive fossil hunting in the history of science. The story is the Morrison Formation, and it is the closest thing we have to a complete portrait of a Jurassic world. The Morrison Formation is a geological unit, a body of sedimentary rock deposited over roughly 8 million years during the late Jurassic, from approximately 156 to 148 million years ago. It was laid down in a vast floodplain environment, an ancient river system that drained the nascent mountain ranges forming to the west as tectonic forces compressed the western edge of North America. The rivers flowed generally eastward and northward across a broad, low-lying plain, depositing their sediment load of mud and sand and pebble in a constantly shifting landscape of river channels, floodplains, lake beds, and temporarily dry areas. The climate of the Morrison world was seasonal and variable. The western part of the floodplain, closer to the mountains and their orographic rainfall, was wetter. The eastern and northern parts were drier, with pronounced dry seasons during which the rivers shrank dramatically, water sources became scarce, and the animals congregated around whatever permanent water remained. This seasonal variability shaped the behaviour of the Morrison fauna in ways that are beginning to be understood through careful analysis of growth rings in fossilised bone, isotopic signatures in teeth and bones, and the spatial distribution of fossils in the rock. Close your eyes and come with me to the Morrison floodplain late in the dry season, somewhere in what will eventually become Utah. The time is mid-morning, and the light is already fierce, white and flattening, drawing the moisture from the cracked clay of the floodplain floor. The vegetation has changed since the wet season ended months ago. The ground cover is low and sparse, the ferns that carpeted the wetter areas now dry and brittle. The larger trees, the conifers along the higher ground, and the gallery forests along the river channels still carry their foliage, but even these show the stress of the dry months in the yellowing of lower needles and the reduced resin flow from damaged bark. The river here has shrunk to perhaps a quarter of its wet season volume. Where it was chest deep and 100 feet wide during the floods, it is now ankle deep and 20 feet wide, a sluggish, warm stream carrying a load of fine, suspended sediment that turns it the colour of milky coffee. And around this river, around this last reliable source of water in miles of increasingly dry landscape, the animals of the Morrison have congregated. There are sauropods first, because there are always sauropods. A mixed group, perhaps 24 individuals of two species. The larger ones are Apatosaurus, formerly known as Brontosaurus, and recently restored to that familiar name, heavy-bodied sauropods with characteristic whip-like tails and relatively stocky build compared to some of their contemporaries. An adult Apatosaurus weighed somewhere between 20 and 30 tons, and its passage was felt in the ground before it was seen or heard. Moving beside them, occupying a slightly different area of the available browse, are several Diplodocus, the long-tailed, low-headed sauropods whose fossil skeletons grace the lobbies of natural history museums on multiple continents. The two species interact but do not directly compete. Their feeding heights overlap somewhat, but Apatosaurus is a heavier, more powerful animal that can push through vegetation that Diplodocus works around. Their daily rhythms are slightly different. The Apatosaurus are most active in the early morning and late afternoon, resting during the fierce midday heat. The Diplodocus feed more continuously, their lower metabolic demands relative to the Apatosaurus perhaps allowing them to sustain a lower but more consistent feeding rate through the hot hours. Near the water's edge, where the soil is moist and the vegetation is slightly denser, a group of Stegosaurus are grazing. There are 6 of them, a mix of adults and subadults. The adults are impressive animals, 15 to 20 feet long, their double row of alternating bony plates along the spine catching the morning light and throwing shadows on their flanks. The function of those plates remains debated among paleontologists. Were they primarily for thermoregulation, absorbing solar heat in the morning and radiating it in the afternoon? Were they primarily for display, for recognizing members of the same species or signaling readiness to mate? Were they secondarily defensive? Almost certainly the answer involves some combination of functions, and the relative importance of each may have varied with the situation. What is not debated is the tail. The 4 spikes at the end of a Stegosaurus tail, each one between 2 and 3 feet long, are unambiguously defensive weapons, and the angles at which they are oriented suggest they were used in horizontal sweeping motions rather than vertical strikes. An Allosaurus approaching a defensive adult Stegosaurus from behind would have faced a tail capable of inflicting injuries severe enough to be fatal. We know this because we have found an Allosaurus caudal vertebra from the Morrison that bears a hole exactly the size and shape of a Stegosaurus tail spike, healed, meaning the Allosaurus survived the wound, but the wound was real. Predators and prey, the eternal conversation. Here at the water's edge, in the late dry season heat, the conversation is mostly quiet. The large predators are not visible at the moment, but they are somewhere. In the gallery forest fringing the river channel, in the denser scrub at the forest edge. The herbivores know they are there. The alertness never entirely fades, even in a moment as apparently peaceful as a morning at the water. The smaller animals are everywhere, filling in the margins. Groups of Camptosaurus, The medium-sized bipedal ornithopods, moving briskly between feeding patches, always keeping one eye on the forest edge. Small Dryosaurus, faster and more nervous. The deer of the Morrison ecosystem, quick enough to outrun many predators, but not powerful enough to defend themselves. Along the river margins, a few Camarasaurus, the compact, robust-skulled sauropod that fed on tougher vegetation than its more gracile Morrison companions. And in the air, the pterosaurs are working the thermals rising from the hot exposed floodplain clay. Their wingspans range from the small, insect-hunting species no larger than a starling to the larger fish hunters that cruise above the river. Their calls, thin and high, carry across the floodplain, and occasionally one stoops to the shallow river surface in a barely-there contact that ends with a small fish secured crosswise in long jaws. This is a moment from a world that lasted millions of years. Not the same individuals, obviously, not the same specific composition of animals around the same specific bend in the same specific river. But this type of moment, this gathering of Morrison animals around a late dry season water source, was happening across the floodplain system for geological ages. Millions of such mornings, millions of such gatherings. The individuals lived and died and were forgotten, but the pattern persisted, generation after generation, because the pattern worked. The Morrison ecosystem was a solution to the problem of living in a seasonal semi-arid floodplain environment with particular plant communities and particular climatic conditions, and it was a good solution. It lasted. The wet season, when it came, transformed everything. The western mountains shed their accumulated rainfall down through the river systems, and the Morrison rivers rose from their dry season trickles to their wet season floods with remarkable speed. Days of rain, of skies that delivered what the dry season had withheld, turning the clay flats to mud, and the mud to shallow lakes, and the river channels to raging torrents, carrying megatons of sediment. The animals dispersed across the flooding landscape, following the advancing vegetation, spreading back into the areas abandoned during the dry months. The sauropods moved to higher ground first as the floodwaters rose, then spread back across the soaking plain, their enormous feet leaving metre-deep tracks in the soft mud that would eventually, millions of years later, be found by small hairless primates who would spend years arguing about what made them. The wet season was a time of abundance, of rapid growth and reproduction, and the recuperation of energy reserves depleted by the dry months. It was also a time of danger, of the flash floods that could sweep animals away without warning, of the deeper channels that caught the unwary, of the diseases and parasites that flourished in standing water. The cycle of wet and dry was not merely a backdrop for Morrison life. It was a fundamental driver of Morrison behaviour, ecology and evolution. This is the world that the Morrison Formation has preserved for us. Not perfectly. Fossils are always incomplete, always partial, always missing the soft tissues and the behaviours and the sounds and the smells, but remarkably, given the time elapsed. The bones tell us enormous amounts if we know how to listen. They tell us about the sizes and proportions and locomotor styles of the animals that made them. They tell us about injuries and diseases and growth rates. They tell us about diets through the wear patterns on teeth and the chemical signatures preserved in enamel. They tell us about behaviour through the patterns of which species appear together and which do not, through the trackways and the nesting sites and the occasional bone beds where multiple individuals died together. The Morrison Formation is not just rocks, it is a library. It is a record, incomplete but extraordinary, of 8 million years of life in a lost world. A world so different from our own that it barely seems possible it occupied the same piece of geography. But it did. The same ground where the Morrison Formation is exposed today was once a Jurassic floodplain. The same sky that is above it now was once crossed by pterosaurs. The same rivers that drain it now are the far descendants of the rivers that deposited the Morrison sediments in the first place. The world changes. The world endures. These are not contradictory statements. They are the same statement, viewed at different scales of time. Let the Morrison world settle around you in the dark. The smell of river mud and warm stone, the deep felt rhythm of sauropod footsteps, the quality of Jurassic light on a Stegosaurus plate, the thin call of pterosaurs above a shrinking river, the patient, enduring ancient rhythm of a world that knew nothing of our world and yet made ours possible. Let it carry you into rest. Everything ends. That is perhaps the most universal truth that deep time teaches us, if we are willing to sit with it without flinching. Not just the lives of individual organisms, which is obvious, and not just the runs of individual species, which we understand intellectually even if we rarely stop to feel the weight of it, but the eras themselves, the geological periods, the stable climate regimes and the ecosystem communities that form within them. Everything that exists in time eventually stops existing in time. Nothing lasts forever, not even worlds that lasted for tens of millions of years. The Jurassic ended 145 million years ago. It did not end with a bang. This is important. When people think about the end of the age of dinosaurs, they think of the Chicxulub asteroid and the catastrophic extinction it caused 66 million years ago, at the end of the Cretaceous. That ending was dramatic. That ending was the kind of geological event that leaves a clear, sharp line in the rock record, a boundary that scientists can find and date precisely. The end of the Jurassic was nothing like that. The Jurassic-Cretaceous boundary, 145 million years ago, is one of the fuzziest, most debated boundaries in the geological timescale. It is not marked by a mass extinction. It is not defined by a catastrophic event. The world of the earliest Cretaceous looks, in many ways, remarkably similar to the world of the latest Jurassic. Many of the same species, or closely related species, were present on both sides of the boundary. The transition from Jurassic to Cretaceous was gradual, driven by the slow accumulation of changes in climate, sea level, geography, and the composition of living communities that came from the continued breakup of Pangaea and the long-term trends in planetary systems. And yet, the Cretaceous world that eventually emerged was genuinely different from the Jurassic world that preceded it. The differences accumulated slowly, imperceptibly to any individual living through them, but they were real and they mattered. Understanding those differences, understanding what changed between the Jurassic and the Cretaceous, and why, is essential to understanding the full arc of dinosaur history. The most fundamental driver of change between the Jurassic and the Cretaceous was the continued breakup of Pangaea. By the end of the Jurassic, the supercontinent that had dominated Earth's geography for 100 million years was no longer recognizable as a single landmass. North America had separated from Europe and Africa along what was becoming the nascent Atlantic Ocean. South America was beginning its slow separation from Africa. The Tethys Sea, a warm, shallow tropical ocean, was widening between the northern landmasses of Laurasia and the southern landmasses of Gondwana. The geography of the world was becoming something closer, in broad outline, to what we would recognize today, though still profoundly different in detail. This geographic restructuring had enormous consequences for climate, ocean circulation, and the distribution of plants and animals. As the ocean basins between the separating continents widened, new patterns of ocean circulation developed. Warm, salty water from the tropical Tethys Sea was no longer contained in a shallow, relatively enclosed basin, but was beginning to circulate more broadly. Sea levels, which had been broadly high through much of the Jurassic, began to fluctuate in ways tied to the changing geometry of the ocean basins and the shifting of tectonic plates. On land, the separating continents meant increasing geographic isolation for populations of animals that had previously been able to interbreed across a connected landmass. Populations separated by widening seaways began diverging genetically, accumulating differences that would eventually produce distinct species, then distinct genera, eventually distinct families. This process of vicariance, the creation of new species through geographic isolation, was one of the engines driving the extraordinary dinosaur diversity of the Cretaceous. The isolation of different continental populations allowed different evolutionary trajectories to develop in parallel, eventually producing the remarkable variety of Cretaceous dinosaurs that inhabited a world of separate continents. The climate of the latest Jurassic was beginning to show changes as well. Sea surface temperatures were shifting in some regions. Precipitation patterns were changing as the geography that drove atmospheric circulation changed. The seasonal monsoon systems that had characterized parts of the Jurassic were being replaced gradually by other patterns driven by the new geography of separating continents. These climatic shifts were reflected in the plant communities, which in turn affected the animal communities that depended on them. One important change in plant communities at the Jurassic-Cretaceous boundary was in the diversity and distribution of different plant groups. The conifers and cycads and ginkgos that had dominated the Jurassic were beginning to face competition from new forms. The first true angiosperms, the flowering plants, were somewhere in this transitional zone. Their origin still debated, but their eventual dominance in the Cretaceous clearly visible in the fossil record. The Jurassic world would not see the full flowering revolution. That belonged to the Cretaceous. But the earliest, most primitive angiosperms were beginning their quiet appearance in the plant record somewhere around the Jurassic-Cretaceous boundary. Another one of those background revolutions that seemed insignificant at the time and proved to be world-changing in retrospect. Imagine standing at the Jurassic-Cretaceous boundary, if you somehow could. The landscape around you would not look dramatically different from the Jurassic landscapes we have been exploring together in this long night's journey. The large sauropods are still here, slightly different species from the ones we followed through the Morrison, but recognisably the same ecological role. The theropods are still present, the pterosaurs are still crossing the sky, the oceans are still full of marine reptiles and ammonites and fish. But if you looked carefully, you might notice that some of the most familiar Jurassic forms are becoming rarer. The long-tailed ramphorhynchoid pterosaurs, so common through the Jurassic, are declining. The short-tailed pterodactyloid pterosaurs, which had also been present through the Jurassic, are becoming more diverse and more dominant. Some of the familiar Jurassic sauropod families are replaced by new ones. The Ornithischian dinosaurs are diversifying more rapidly, beginning to fill ecological roles that were previously dominated by sauropods in some regions, and somewhere, in habitats that are not yet well represented in our fossil record, small feathered dinosaurs are continuing their quiet revolution. The lineage that would give rise to modern birds is evolving, experimenting, diversifying. The transition to powered flight has happened. Its consequences are only beginning to unfold. Now consider what the end of the Jurassic feels like from inside the ecosystem. Not the dramatic end of the Cretaceous, with an asteroid and mass extinction and the collapse of everything familiar. This is a different kind of ending, gradual, cumulative, invisible in any human lifetime, visible only in the patient accumulation of the geological record. This kind of ending is, in many ways, more frightening than the dramatic kind. The asteroid that ended the Cretaceous was an event so severe, so sudden, so clearly catastrophic, that in its wake nothing could pretend that the world had not fundamentally changed. The Jurassic did not end that way. The Jurassic ended the way most things end, not all at once, but gradually, and then all at once only in retrospect when you look at the rock record from a sufficient distance to see the pattern. There is a lesson in this for anyone who has ears to hear it. Change is usually invisible from inside. The world we inhabit always feels stable, always feels like the permanent condition, always feels like the baseline against which other conditions are deviations. The Jurassic world, to us, every creature living in it, was simply the world. Not the Jurassic, not a temporary configuration of continents and climates and species assemblages destined to be replaced, but simply the way things were, the way they had always been, the way they presumably always would be. And then slowly it changed, and then it was the Cretaceous, and the Cretaceous felt like the world, the permanent, stable, unchanging world to every creature living in it, until that one ended too. And now we are here, in our moment, which also feels like the permanent world, the baseline, the stable condition. The deep past is patient on this point. It does not insist on conclusions. It simply presents its record of change and endurance and transformation, and lets those who are paying attention draw whatever wisdom they can. The Jurassic period lasted 56 million years. It produced some of the most extraordinary animals in the history of life. It created and sustained ecosystems of extraordinary complexity and beauty. And then, gradually, without drama, it gave way to what came next. Its creatures evolved or went extinct. Its plants were replaced by new forms. Its climate reorganized itself around new geographic realities. The Jurassic did not disappear. It transformed. The Cretaceous was, in a real sense, made of Jurassic material, the surviving lineages, and the ecological frameworks and the evolutionary potential that the Jurassic had created and sustained. And the Cretaceous made us. Not directly, not in a simple chain of cause and effect, but in the sense that the mammals who survived the end Cretaceous extinction and eventually gave rise to all the mammalian diversity that eventually produced primates, that eventually produced us. Those mammals evolved in the shadow of the dinosaurs. They were shaped by the world the dinosaurs maintained, constrained by it, and ultimately liberated by its end. Without the Jurassic, there would have been no Cretaceous of the kind that actually existed. Without the Cretaceous, there would have been no mammals of the kinds that actually survived. Without those mammals, there would have been no primates. Without those primates, there would have been no humans. You are, in the most literal sense, a consequence of the Jurassic. The world that produced you began with those small, marginal dinosaurs surviving the Triassic extinction. It continued through the extraordinary diversification of the Jurassic, through the rise of the giants and the sky-crossing pterosaurs and the ocean-ruling marine reptiles and the small feathered coelurosaurs beginning their quiet journey toward the sky. The thread from those first Jurassic dinosaurs to the body you're resting in right now is unbroken. Attenuated by 200 million years, redirected many times by extinction and evolution and the long, slow accumulation of change, but unbroken. You are made of the Jurassic. You are made of deep time, and deep time is very, very old and very, very patient and very, very good at making things that last. Let that thought settle into your bones, the weight of that ancient connection, the improbable, beautiful fact of your existence at the far end of an unbroken chain of life that reaches back to the Jurassic and before. Everything that lives today is the descendant of survivors, the inheritors of deep time, the latest expression of a story that began before the Jurassic and will continue long after us. Rest in the weight of it. Rest in the ancient patience of deep time. We have come a long way tonight. We have crossed 200 million years of time, following the arc of a world from its traumatic beginning, through its extraordinary middle to its gradual transformation into something new. We have stood at the threshold of the early Jurassic and watched dinosaurs begin to fill a world emptied by extinction. We have walked beside the giants, felt the ground shake with sauropod footsteps that no human ear has ever truly heard. We have looked up into a sky crossed by membranous wings and looked down into warm ancient seas alive with creatures no human eye has ever seen. We have watched the smallest, most unassuming members of the dinosaur family tree quietly preparing the revolution that would eventually give the world its birds. And we have stood at the end of the Jurassic and watched the world, slowly and without drama, become something else. The Jurassic is over. It has been over for 145 million years. Every creature we have met tonight is gone, their bones turned to stone in the rocks beneath the surface of a world they would not recognize. The forests they moved through are gone. The oceans they swam in have reorganized themselves entirely. The geography they knew has been rearranged slowly and continuously by the tectonic forces that have been reshaping this planet since long before the dinosaurs and will go on reshaping it long after us. And yet, the Jurassic will always have existed. This is the strange, comforting truth that deep time offers to those who are willing to sit with it in the quiet of the night. The past cannot be unmade. Every moment that has ever occurred is permanently part of the universe's history. The morning when the first true sauropod stood at full adult size and was simply, unmistakably, the largest land animal that had ever walked the earth, that morning happened. It is as real, in the fundamental accounting of reality, as this moment. The afternoon when an Allosaurus stood over a kill in the Morrison floodplain, the late Jurassic light golden on its scales, that afternoon happened. The moment when a small feathered coelurosaur spread its arms to leap between branches in a Jurassic forest and generated, for perhaps the first time, a tiny amount of aerodynamic lift that was not quite flight, but was the very earliest edge of flight, that moment happened. These things were real. They took place in the universe we inhabit, and no amount of time can reach back and unmake them. This is a strange source of comfort, perhaps. But it is a genuine one. The world is very old and very strange and contains wonders that are entirely beyond our ability to perceive directly, locked in deep time, accessible only through the patient work of scientists and the imaginative capacity of minds willing to follow the evidence into the far past. And one of those wonders is the Jurassic. 56 million years of forests and floodplains and ancient seas. 56 million years of giants walking the earth and wings crossing the sky and life in all its extraordinary variety going about the business of living. It was real. It happened. And the fact that it happened is one of the most remarkable things about the universe we live in. So as you drift now towards sleep, let the Jurassic go quietly. It does not need to be held onto. It is already held, permanently and safely, in the record of deep time, in the rocks beneath your feet, in the bones of the birds that will sing outside your window in the morning. It is there. It will always be there. Let yourself imagine one last Jurassic moment. It is night on the Morrison floodplain, a warm night in the middle of the wet season, and the air is thick with the smell of rain and living things. The river is high and the floodplain is silver with standing water, reflecting a sky full of stars that look, from down here in the darkness, like everything is possible. There are sounds, insects as always, somewhere close the low, resonant breathing of something very large resting in the darkness. A pterosaur calls once, high and thin, and then is quiet. The stars turn slowly overhead. The river moves. The world breathes. 56 million years of this, and counting. The weight of it, and the beauty of it, and the improbable fact of it settling around you like a warm, ancient darkness. Let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of that ancient world. Let the stars of the Jurassic sky be the last thing your mind holds before it releases even that and slides into the deeper dark of sleep. The Jurassic is waiting, 200 million years back down the long corridor of time, patient and complete and real. You can visit it any night. It will always be there. Good night. And before you close your eyes completely, just one thought to carry with you into your dreams. Somewhere in the world tonight there is a paleontologist who has spent decades carefully brushing stone away from the bones of a Jurassic creature. What is the most extraordinary dinosaur you have ever learned about, and what made it feel real to you? Leave it in the comments. The ancient world is best explored together. Let us return to the Late Triassic one more time, because there is more to tell about the world that ended and the world that began. The year is approximately 215 million years ago, and we are somewhere in what will eventually become North America, in the region that will one day be called the American Southwest. The landscape around you is unlike anything in the modern world. The ground is rust-red sandstone and mudstone, baked by a sun that is somewhat brighter than the one we know, because the Earth is slightly closer to it at this point in its orbit, or rather because the atmospheric composition slightly alters how the light feels. The air smells dry, dusty. There is a faint mineral smell that you cannot quite identify, the smell of oxidized iron in the sediment and the particular quality of dry desert air that has travelled a long way over hot stone before reaching you. The vegetation here is sparse, low-growing ferns along the few watercourses, cycads, their crown of primitive fronds catching the light. A few scattered conifers in the better watered areas, gnarled and slow-growing, their roots reaching deep for whatever moisture persists in the lower layers of rock. This is not a lush world. This is a world where water is everything, where life concentrates around the rare, certain sources of it, and thins to almost nothing in between. But it is not empty. Nothing in Earth's history is ever truly empty if you know where to look. In the shadow of a large boulder, where the rock creates a pocket of shade that keeps the temperature several degrees below the baking open ground, there is movement. A colossal, one of the most abundant and best known of the late Triassic dinosaurs, is picking its way carefully along the base of the rock face, its three-fingered hands held close to its body, its long neck extended slightly forward in the alert posture of an animal that is simultaneously hunter and potential prey. It is perhaps 6 feet long. Its bones are hollow and light, its muscles lean, its skin probably covered in a fine integument of some kind, perhaps early protofeathers, perhaps scales. The evidence is not clear for animals of this particular period. Coelophysis lived in what is now the American Southwest in large numbers, at least at certain times and in certain places. We know this because there is a site in New Mexico called Ghost Ranch where hundreds of Coelophysis skeletons were found jumbled together in a single bone bed, a deposit that probably represents a mass death event of some kind, perhaps a catastrophic flood that swept a group or groups of Coelophysis into a river that buried them in sediment before they could decompose. This site gave us more information about Coelophysis than any other single discovery, revealing not just its anatomy in extraordinary detail, but also suggesting social behaviour, the tendency to congregate in groups that may have had implications for hunting strategy or predator avoidance. The Coelophysis at the rock base has spotted something. A small lizard, one of the many small reptiles that inhabited the late Triassic ecosystem, has emerged from a crack in the rock face to bask in the morning sun. The lizard is perhaps 8 inches long, absolutely oblivious to the predator 6 feet away. The Colossal freezes. Absolute stillness. The only movement a barely perceptible shifting of weight that is entirely forward, the way a cat shifts when it has decided to commit. Then it strikes. Head forward on the long neck, jaws snapping shut, and the lizard is gone. This moment, this ordinary predatory moment in the life of a late Triassic dinosaur, is repeated millions of times a day across the late Triassic world. It is not dramatic. It does not make the fossil record in any direct way. It simply is one small transaction in the vast, constant economy of life. But it tells us something. It tells us that before the Jurassic, before the Great Radiation and the emergence of giants, there were these small, quick, opportunistic animals doing the basic work of staying alive in a difficult world. And doing it well. Quelophysis was successful enough to persist for millions of years. It spread widely. It diversified. It was one of the foundations on which the Jurassic theropod radiation was eventually built. Not far from the Quelophysis, with its small meal, a very different kind of animal is moving through the scrub. It is a Rauisuchian, one of the large crocodile-line archosaurs that dominated the apex predator role in the late Triassic. This one is a substantial animal, perhaps 15 feet long, walking with a semi-erect posture that is different from the fully erect posture of the dinosaurs but considerably more efficient than the sprawling gait of true crocodiles. Its skull is deep and powerful, its teeth conical and sharp, designed for seizing and killing prey considerably larger than itself. Rauisuchians were the dominant large predators of the late Triassic, and they were formidable animals. The dinosaurs of this era, for the most part, could not compete with them directly. They were smaller, less powerful, less capable of taking on the largest available prey. They survived by being fast, by being versatile, by being able to exploit the niches that the Rauisuchians did not fill. The ecological relationship between the early dinosaurs and the Rauisuchians was not one of direct competition for the same resources. It was a more complex relationship of coexistence, with the dinosaurs finding space in the margins of ecosystems dominated by their more powerful contemporaries. And then the End-Triassic extinction struck, and the Rauisuchians, those dominant predators, were gone. Almost overnight in geological terms, the apex predator niches of the terrestrial world were empty. The animals that had most successfully occupied those niches were among the groups hit hardest by the extinction. And the dinosaurs, the fast, versatile, marginally adapted opportunists, were among the survivors. This is not a story about dinosaur superiority. It is a story about luck and circumstance, about the difference between being adapted for the conditions that happen to exist when a catastrophe strikes, and being adapted for conditions that no longer exist. The Rauisuchians were not inferior animals. In the late Triassic, they were the superior animals. They were better adapted for the late Triassic world than any dinosaur of their time. They simply had the bad fortune to be well adapted to a world that was about to disappear. The dinosaurs had the good fortune to be generalists in a world that was about to favour generalism above all else. Not because they foresaw what was coming, not because they were in any sense prepared for the opportunity the extinction would give them, simply because the body plan they happened to have, and the behavioural flexibility they happened to possess, and the ecological position they happened to occupy, all combined to make them survivors in conditions that killed their more successful competitors. Fortune. Deep time is full of fortune, good and bad, distributed without plan or purpose across the vast span of life's history. The dinosaurs got lucky at the end of the Triassic. The mammals got lucky at the end of the Cretaceous. We got lucky, in an evolutionary sense, at several points in the Cenozoic, and the luck does not make the story less remarkable. If anything, it makes it more so, because it reminds us that nothing about the present was inevitable, that every moment in the history of life could have gone differently, and that the world we inhabit is just one of the countless worlds that could have been. The late Triassic fades, the extinction approaches and then passes, and in its wake, in the simplified, recovering world of the earliest Jurassic, small dinosaurs are spreading across an empty landscape, moving into the open niches, testing new possibilities, beginning the extraordinary diversification that will make the Jurassic the world it becomes. The early Jurassic world was shaped by a climate that was warmer and more uniform than ours, a world without polar ice caps where temperate forests stretched much further toward the poles than they do today. This global warmth had consequences for the distribution of life across the planet's surface. Tropical and subtropical conditions extended much further from the equator than they do in our world, meaning that many dinosaur species could range across latitudes that would be inhospitable to large reptiles today. The lack of polar ice caps also meant that global sea levels were somewhat higher than they are now. Large portions of the continents that are today elevated above sea level were, in the early Jurassic, covered by shallow epicontinental seas. These shallow marine environments were important ecologically, providing habitat for diverse communities of marine organisms and creating coastlines that were more extensive and more varied than those of the modern world. The ocean chemistry of the early Jurassic was still recovering from the acidification and oxygen depletion associated with the end Triassic event, but recovery was underway. The ammonites, those coiled cephalopods that had been severely reduced by the extinction, were already diversifying again, their distinctive coiled shells beginning to appear in increasing variety in the marine sediments of the earliest Jurassic. Fish were recovering, marine reptiles were beginning to diversify, the ocean was rebuilding itself. On land, the plant communities of the early Jurassic were dominated by ferns, horsetails, conifers, cycads, and ginkgos. The precise composition varied by latitude and local conditions, but this basic set of plant groups characterized Jurassic floras across the world. Ferns were often the ground-level dominant, forming dense carpets in open areas and along water margins. Horsetails grew in the wet areas, their segmented stems and whorled branches creating thickets along rivers and lakeshores. The conifers rose above everything else, their canopies forming the upper story of Jurassic forests. The animals that depended on these plants were adapting to their particular nutritional and structural properties. Cycad fronds, for instance, are tough and waxy, requiring specialized digestive systems to process efficiently. The early dinosaurian herbivores that fed on them were beginning to develop the dental and digestive adaptations that would eventually allow the great sauropods to process enormous quantities of low-nutrition vegetation efficiently enough to sustain bodies weighing tens of tons. This relationship between plant chemistry and herbivore anatomy is one of the underappreciated drivers of dinosaur evolution. The dinosaurs did not simply evolve their remarkable body plans in a vacuum. They evolved them in response to the specific plant communities available to them, in the context of specific competitive pressures from other herbivores, in the context of predation pressure from the theropods. Evolution is always contextual, always shaped by the specific conditions of the specific environments in which it operates. The great sauropods were not just large because large was advantageous in some abstract sense. They were large because the specific plant resources of the Jurassic, in their specific distributions and nutritional profiles, made large body size with particular digestive strategies the winning approach. The early Jurassic also saw the first diversification of the major dinosaur clades into recognizable ecological roles. The ornithischians, previously limited to small bipedal forms, were beginning to explore larger body sizes and new dietary strategies. The sauropodomorphs were showing the first clear signs of the gigantism that would define them in the Middle and Late Jurassic. The theropods were diversifying into both large predator and small insectivore niches. The basic ecological framework of the dinosaurian world was being established. One aspect of early Jurassic dinosaur biology that deserves attention is what we know and what we do not know about dinosaur physiology. Were dinosaurs warm-blooded? Were they cold-blooded? The answer, as far as modern science can determine, is that the question is probably not the right one to ask. Dinosaurs were neither straightforwardly warm-blooded like mammals and birds, nor straightforwardly cold-blooded like modern reptiles. They seem to have occupied a range of physiological strategies between these extremes, with different species at different points on the spectrum, and with metabolic rates that were generally higher than those of modern crocodiles, but perhaps lower in the larger species than in modern mammals. This metabolic variability is interesting from an ecological standpoint, because it implies that different dinosaur species were making different energy economy trade-offs. A high metabolic animal is more energetically expensive to maintain, but is capable of higher sustained activity levels and is less dependent on external heat sources for thermoregulation. A lower metabolic animal is cheaper to run, but is more constrained in its activity patterns and more vulnerable to temperature fluctuations. The diversity of dinosaur metabolic strategies may have been one of the factors that allowed so many dinosaur species to coexist in the same ecosystems, with different species exploiting different parts of the energy economy available to them. These physiological considerations mattered enormously in the early Jurassic, when the climate was warm but variable and the food resources were in the process of recovery from the end Triassic extinction. The dinosaurs that survived and diversified in this recovering world were the ones whose physiological strategies best matched the conditions available to them. And once established, those strategies became the foundations on which the extraordinary diversity of the Middle and Late Jurassic was built. Imagine the early Jurassic forest in the morning, when the light is still low and the air is cool from the night. Mist rises from the wetter areas, from the river margins and the low-lying fern meadows, and in the mist there is movement. A group of early sauropodomorphs, perhaps a species of Massospondylus from what is now southern Africa, is moving along the forest edge, their necks extended to reach the cycad fronds at the edge of the woodland. They are not enormous animals yet, perhaps 15 to 20 feet long, but they carry in their anatomy the beginnings of the body plan that will eventually produce the true giants. The long neck is already there. The tendency toward quadrupedal posture is already present, though these animals still retain the ability to rear up on their hind legs when needed. The broad, deep gut that will eventually house the extensive digestive system of a true sauropod is beginning to be expressed. They are browsing steadily, moving slowly along the forest edge, selecting the most accessible fronds without wasting energy on unnecessary movement. There is a quality of patience to their feeding that will characterize their descendants for the next 130 million years. Sauropods, proto-sauropods, all of them fed with a kind of steady, methodical efficiency that spoke to the scale of their nutritional requirements. Eat, move, eat again. The rhythm was the rhythm of their lives. In the trees above the browsing sauropodomorphs, a small coelurosaur is watching from the shadow of a conifer branch. It is perhaps 2 feet long, alert and quick, its eyes following the movements of a large insect that has landed on a nearby branch. This small animal, unremarkable in the context of its ecosystem, is carrying in its genes the future of aviation. Not metaphorically, literally. The lineage that will eventually produce Archaeopteryx, and from there eventually produce every bird that will ever fly, is present in the early Jurassic in animals very much like this one. Small, quick, feathered probably, or beginning to be feathered, making a living in the spaces between the larger animals, finding food in the forest canopy and the leaf litter, and the warm air above the forest where insects rise on thermals in the morning. The small coelurosaur snatches the insect with a movement too fast to follow clearly and disappears back into the shadow of the conifer. The sauropodomorphs continue to browse below. The mist thins as the sun rises higher and the morning warmth burns it away. The early Jurassic world goes about its ordinary business. To understand Jurassic predation fully, you need to think about it at multiple scales simultaneously. There is the scale of the individual predatory event, the moment-by-moment drama of pursuit and capture that we have already described. There is the scale of the individual predator's life, the long arc of growth from hatchling to adult, the years of practice and refinement of hunting skills, the gradual accumulation of experience, and there is the scale of the ecosystem, the broad patterns of predator and prey population dynamics that played out across the entire Morrison floodplain over millions of years. At the ecosystem scale, the relationship between predator and prey populations is one of the most studied topics in ecology, and the basic dynamics have been understood since the early 20th century. Prey populations support predator populations, but predator populations also regulate prey populations. When prey is abundant, predators have enough food to reproduce successfully, and their numbers increase. When predator numbers increase, they take more prey, and prey populations begin to decline. As prey declines, predators begin to face food shortage, their reproductive success falls, and their numbers eventually decline as well. With fewer predators, prey populations recover, and the cycle begins again. This basic oscillation, this predator-prey cycle, was operating in the Jurassic just as it operates in every ecosystem today. The numbers of Allosaurus in the Morrison were regulated by the availability of their prey, which was in turn regulated by the availability of vegetation, which was in turn regulated by the climate and the nutrient content of the soil. Every species was embedded in these relationships, connected to every other species through the web of feeding and competition, and parasitism and mutualism that constituted the Morrison ecosystem. Large predators like Allosaurus faced a particular challenge that is worth thinking about. They were energetically expensive to maintain, requiring large amounts of food to sustain their bulk. But large prey was not always available, and the energetic cost of a failed hunt was significant. A large predator that regularly failed to make kills would deplete its energy reserves and eventually starve. This pressure favoured the evolution of hunting strategies that minimised the risk of failure, that maximised the probability of a successful kill for a given expenditure of energy. The fossil evidence suggests that Allosaurus may have used a variety of strategies depending on circumstances. For smaller, more vulnerable prey like juvenile sauropods or small ornithopods, an active pursuit strategy was probably feasible. For larger prey, a more ambush-oriented approach, relying on surprise and the initial rush to bring down or disable the target before it could use its defensive capabilities effectively, seems more likely. And some evidence suggests that Allosaurus may have engaged in group hunting, cooperative behaviour that allowed multiple individuals to tackle prey too large or too dangerous for a single predator. The evidence for Allosaurus group hunting is indirect but suggestive. Multiple Allosaurus individuals have been found in association with the bones of large sauropods at some Morrison sites, which could indicate either cooperative hunting or opportunistic scavenging or both. It is very unlikely that a single Allosaurus could have brought down a healthy adult Apatosaurus. An animal weighing 25 tons, equipped with a powerful tail and capable of crushing an attacker under its sheer body weight, would have been an extremely dangerous target for a predator weighing perhaps 2 tons. But multiple Allosaurus working in coordination, harassing a sauropod from multiple directions, targeting vulnerable areas like the hindquarters or the neck, might have been able to bring even a large adult down, particularly if the sauropod was old, injured, or weakened in some other way. Group hunting, if it occurred, would have required a level of behavioural coordination that implies something interesting about Allosaurus cognition. Not human-level intelligence, not language-based communication, but the kind of social awareness and behavioural coordination that we see in modern pack hunters like wolves or African wild dogs, where animals learn to read each other's behaviour and respond in ways that enhance the effectiveness of the group. This kind of social intelligence leaves few direct traces in the fossil record, but the behavioural ecology of the Morrison ecosystem was probably far more sophisticated than the term primitive reptile would suggest. Consider also the young. Dinosaur eggs and hatchlings were vulnerable in ways that adult animals were not. The nest sites of large dinosaurs would have been targets for smaller predators and scavengers. The period between hatching and the attainment of sufficient size to be safe from most predators was a critical vulnerability window. Evidence from bone growth rates suggests that many dinosaurs grew remarkably quickly compared to modern reptiles, reaching a substantial fraction of adult size within a relatively few years. This rapid growth would have reduced the duration of the vulnerable juvenile period, minimizing the time during which young dinosaurs were accessible to the full range of predators rather than only the very largest. Parental care in dinosaurs remains a topic of active research. The famous nesting sites discovered in Mongolia and Montana in the 1970s and 1980s, associated with hadrosaurs and the sauropod-related Maiasaura, provided strong evidence that at least some dinosaurs invested substantially in parental care, tending nests and possibly feeding hatchlings in a way that has no parallel in modern crocodilians, their closest living relatives. The full range of parental care strategies across dinosaur diversity is not yet known, but the evidence suggests that dinosaur reproductive behaviour was more complex and varied than earlier assumptions based on their reptilian classification had suggested. All of these behavioural and ecological complexities were embedded in the Morrison ecosystem, operating continuously through the 8 million years of the formation's deposition. The ecosystem was not a static snapshot, but a dynamic, continuously evolving community of species interacting with each other and with their environment across time. Species went locally extinct and were replaced by closely related forms. Climate fluctuations altered the productivity of the vegetation, which altered the composition of the herbivore community, which altered the predator community in turn. The Morrison Formation preserves the record of a living, breathing, changing world, not a museum diorama. And that dynamism, that continuous change and adaptation and evolution within the broad framework of the Jurassic ecosystem is what makes the fossil record so rich and so endlessly surprising. Every new fossil brings new information. Every new site provides a new window into the ecosystem at a slightly different time or place. The Morrison Formation has been studied intensively for 150 years, and it continues to yield new discoveries, new species, new behavioral insights, new evidence of ecological relationships that were not previously understood. The Jurassic predator story is not finished. Not because it has not ended, it ended 145 million years ago, but because we have not yet finished reading it. The rocks still have more to tell. The Jurassic oceans deserve more than we have given them. To truly do justice to the marine world of the Jurassic, to understand the full scope of what existed in those warm, ancient seas, requires going deeper than the most famous genera and the most dramatic predators. The base of the Jurassic marine food web was built, as marine food webs always are, on photosynthesis. Phytoplankton, microscopic photosynthetic organisms floating in the sunlit upper layers of the ocean, were converting sunlight and dissolved nutrients into organic matter that supported every higher level of the food web. The composition and productivity of the Jurassic phytoplankton community was different from today's in specific ways, reflecting both the different chemistry of the Jurassic Ocean and the evolutionary history of the major phytoplankton groups, but the basic function was the same. The ocean's food web began with sunlight and water and dissolved carbon dioxide and built upward from there. The zooplankton that fed on the phytoplankton were diverse and abundant. Among the most important were the ammonites, though technically the ammonites are nekton, free-swimming animals rather than true plankton. The ammonites of the Jurassic were extraordinarily diverse. Their distinctive coiled shells, some smooth and simple, others elaborately ornamented with ribs and tubercles and spines, are among the most common fossils from Jurassic marine deposits. The diversity of shell forms reflected a diversity of ecological strategies. Some ammonites were probably relatively slow, drift-feeding animals living near the surface. Others were more active swimmers capable of pursuing prey or escaping predators. Some may have spent time at depth, their chambered shells providing buoyancy control that allowed them to regulate their depth in the water column. The ammonites were also, for paleontologists, extraordinarily useful index fossils. Because different ammonite species had limited stratigraphic ranges, appearing and disappearing from the fossil record over relatively short geological time intervals, they can be used to correlate rock layers from different parts of the world. A geologist in England finding a particular ammonite assemblage can confidently match it to rocks from France or Germany or North Africa that contain the same assemblage, even without any physical connection between the rock formations. The ammonites gave the Jurassic oceans a kind of geological clock, ticking off the millennia in the evolution of new shell forms. Beyond the ammonites, the Jurassic seafloor supported rich communities of invertebrates, from the echinoderms, sea urchins and crinoids and starfish, to bivalves and gastropods of many kinds, to the brachiopods whose numbers had declined from the Paleozoic but were still significant components of the benthic community. In the reef environments, new types of reef-building organisms were establishing, themselves in the wake of the end Triassic collapse of previous reef systems. The scleractinian corals, the group that builds modern coral reefs, were recovering and diversifying, and while the reefs of the Jurassic were not as extensive as the reef systems of the Triassic had been, or the modern reefs are now, they were present and ecologically significant in the warmer, shallower regions of the Jurassic Sea. The fish fauna of the Jurassic was diverse and evolving rapidly. The earliest representatives of many modern fish lineages appear in Jurassic rocks. The teleosts, the group that includes the vast majority of modern bony fish species, from salmon and tuna to goldfish and seahorses, were present and beginning their diversification. The rays and early sharks were exploring the available niches. Hybodont sharks, an extinct group that had been present since before the dinosaurs, were still common in Jurassic seas. And over all of this, the marine reptiles presided. The ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs were not the only marine reptiles of the Jurassic, though they were the most prominent. The geosaurs and other marine crocodilians occupied a different set of niches, probably concentrated in shallower, more coastal environments where they could transition between land and sea. Their elongated skulls and streamlined bodies were adaptations for an aquatic lifestyle, though they never committed to the ocean as completely as the ichthyosaurs had. The most important ecological fact about the Jurassic Ocean is its warmth. With no polar ice caps and elevated levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide, the Jurassic Ocean was substantially warmer than the modern ocean, especially in the middle and high latitudes. Warm water holds less dissolved oxygen than cold water, which creates challenges for large, active animals with high oxygen demands. The marine reptiles of the Jurassic had to balance their metabolic needs against the limitations imposed by ocean temperature and oxygen availability. This challenge may have been one of the factors driving the evolution of very large body size in some Jurassic marine reptiles. Large bodies, counterintuitively, can be more efficient in certain warm water environments, because the ratio of gill surface area to body volume decreases with size, which in a fish would be a problem, but in an air-breathing reptile like an ichthyosaur or plesiosaur is not a constraint at all. Large air-breathing marine reptiles can dive deep into the water column, where oxygen levels may be lower but food resources are available, hold their breath for extended periods, and surface to breathe where oxygen is abundant. Large body size also provides thermal stability in warm seas, reducing the energetic cost of maintaining body temperature. Understanding the Jurassic requires understanding the ground beneath it, the rock record that has preserved its evidence for us across 145 million years. The science of reading the Jurassic from its rocks is one of the most technically demanding and intellectually satisfying endeavours in all of natural science, and its results are, in a very real sense, the foundation for everything we have explored together tonight. The rocks that preserve the Jurassic world are sedimentary rocks, formed from the accumulation and lithification of sediment particles deposited in ancient environments. Different sedimentary environments produce different kinds of rock. River channels deposit coarser sand and gravel. Floodplains accumulate finer silts and muds. Lake bottoms collect very fine-grained sediments, often mixed with the organic matter from dead organisms. Desert environments produce aeolian sandstones deposited by wind rather than water, with the distinctive large-scale crossbedding produced by migrating sand dunes. Shallow marine environments deposit carbonates, limestones, and similar rocks, formed from the shells and skeletons of marine organisms. Each of these rock types preserves a different record of the ancient environment. The grain size of a sandstone tells you about the energy of the environment in which it was deposited. A coarse, poorly sorted sandstone speaks of a high-energy environment, a fast river or a storm beach. A fine, well-sorted sandstone speaks of a lower energy, more uniform environment, a desert dune field or a shallow marine shelf. The colour of a rock tells you about the chemistry of the environment during and after deposition. Red. Rocks have been oxidized, exposed to oxygen-rich conditions. Grey and black rocks contain organic matter, indicating reducing conditions where organic material was preserved rather than decomposed. The fossils within the rock tell you who lived there. Not all organisms have equal preservation potential. Hard parts, bones and shells and teeth and wood are far more likely to be preserved than soft tissues, which typically decompose before burial can occur. This means that the fossil record is systematically biased toward organisms with hard parts and toward environments where burial was rapid enough to prevent complete decomposition before fossilization could begin. The Morrison Formation, with its extraordinary dinosaur fauna, was preserved because the ancient floodplain environment was one where burial could be rapid. A carcass that fell into, or was washed into a river channel, could be buried under sediment quickly enough to begin the mineralization process that eventually converts bone to rock. A carcass that died on dry ground and was exposed to the elements and scavengers typically left no trace at all. This taphonomic bias, this filter through which only certain organisms in certain environments became fossils, is important to keep in mind when interpreting what the fossil record tells us. The Morrison dinosaurs we know are the ones that happen to die in preservable circumstances. The full diversity of Morrison life was certainly greater than what the fossil record has revealed. The Solnhofen Lagoon, from which Archaeopteryx and so many other extraordinary Jurassic fossils are known, preserved exceptional detail because of the unusual chemistry of its bottom waters. The anaerobic conditions prevented scavenging and decomposition, allowing soft tissue outlines and even colour-preserving melanosomes to survive into the fossil record. The Solnhofen is exceptional among geological formations precisely because it gives us a view of the Jurassic, that normal taphonomy would never allow. Every time a new Solnhofen fossil is described, it adds detail to our understanding of Jurassic life that no other formation in the world could provide. The process of reading these rocks, of extracting from their chemistry and structure and fossil content the story of the world that produced them, is the work of generations of scientists. It began in the early 19th century when the first systematic descriptions of Jurassic fossils were published. It continued through the great fossil rushes of the late 19th century when enormous quantities of material were excavated from the Morrison Formation in the bitter rivalries of Köppen Marsh. It continues today in university laboratories around the world where new analytical techniques, from CT scanning to isotopic analysis to molecular paleontology, are extracting information from fossils that their discoverers could never have imagined. The Jurassic is not just a past world. It is an ongoing scientific project, an active field of inquiry where new discoveries regularly reshape our understanding of what the Jurassic actually was. Every year, new species are described. Every year, new behavioral or physiological inferences are drawn from existing specimens using new methods. Every year, the picture of the Jurassic world becomes a little more complete, a little more detailed, a little more surprising. This ongoing process of discovery is one of the most wonderful things about the science of deep time. The past is fixed, it happened, it cannot be changed, but our understanding of the past is not fixed at all. It is dynamic, growing, continuously revised by new evidence. The Jurassic we understand today is richer and stranger and more detailed than the Jurassic that Köppen Marsh were excavating in the 1870s. And the Jurassic that scientists will understand 50 years from now will be richer and stranger and more detailed than the one we understand today. The ancient world is patient. It has been waiting for us to find it, layer by layer, bone by bone, chemical signature by chemical signature, for the entire span of human scientific inquiry, and it still has secrets. There are entire groups of Jurassic organisms for which we have almost no fossil record. There are entire continents where the Jurassic rock record is poorly explored. There are Jurassic behaviours and physiological processes that have left no direct evidence but that must have existed. The story of the Jurassic is not finished being told. It may never be finished being told. Let that thought accompany you towards sleep. The ancient world, with all its complexity and strangeness and beauty still being discovered, still giving up its secrets, one patient excavation at a time, still teaching us 200 million years after the fact about the extraordinary, improbable, endlessly surprising history of life on Earth. The Jurassic is not behind glass in a museum. It is alive in the ongoing work of science, growing more real and more detailed with every passing year, and it is alive in you, in the deep history of the cells of your body, in the evolutionary legacy that connects you to every living thing on Earth through the long, continuous thread of life that stretches back to the Jurassic and before. You are the latest expression of an ancient story, the most recent chapter in a history that began long before the Jurassic, ran through the Jurassic in all its extraordinary richness, and continued from there through extinction and recovery and diversification to arrive, eventually at this moment, at this night, at the sound of your own breathing in the dark. Let us take one more moment before we fully surrender to sleep, one more quiet immersion in the Jurassic world, this time not as scientists or observers, but simply as presences in the ancient landscape, following a single day from beginning to end. It is dawn on the Morrison floodplain, 150 million years ago. The sky in the east is beginning to lighten, a pale grey warming toward the warm gold that the Jurassic sun produces at low angles, a quality of light that, if you could see it, you would probably recognise. The atmosphere of the late Jurassic was different from ours in composition, and the sun was fractionally different in output, but a sunrise is a sunrise in any age. The quality of light at the very first moments of day is something that has been essentially continuous throughout the history of Earth. Light has always had this quality at dawn. It always will. The sounds begin before the light. Insects first, because insects are the great background music of any warm climate ecosystem on land. The morning insects of the Jurassic are different in their specifics from the morning insects of today. No crickets exactly as we know them, no cicadas quite as we know them, but the basic acoustic ecology is similar. A layered, complex soundscape of small bodies producing sounds for communication and for reasons we barely understand. A living sound that rises with the temperature and falls with it again, a constant reminder that the world is full of life at every scale. Then the larger sounds begin. Sauropod footsteps, felt before they are heard, a low-frequency vibration that carries through the soil, the calls of pterosaurs beginning their morning activity. The movement of ornithopods in the denser scrub, a rustling and the occasional snap of a branch. The Morrison is waking up. The first light catches the plates of a Stegosaurus already grazing at the forest edge, and the plates catch the colour of the sky, turning from grey to rose to gold as the sun angles upward. The animal pays no attention to the light. It is eating. It is always eating when it is not sleeping or defending itself, because eating is the primary occupation of a large herbivore. But if you could stand near enough to watch without disturbing it, there would be something almost meditative about the steady, rhythmic work of its feeding, the slow movement from plant to plant, the methodical stripping of fronds and leaves, the patience of a creature whose life is built around the slow accumulation of enough plant material to sustain a body that weighs 4 tons. The morning hours are the most active time on the Morrison floodplain. The temperature is comfortable, not yet reaching the fierce heat of midday. The animals that were resting overnight are moving, feeding, doing the business of the day. Near the river, the main herd of sauropods is beginning to move, a procession that takes half an hour to pass any fixed point. The adults first, their footsteps shaking the ground, then the juveniles, smaller versions of the same basic body plan, less certain in their movements, but learning rapidly. By midday, the heat is at its peak and the pace of the floodplain world slows. The large sauropods seek what shade the conifer canopy provides and stand still, their enormous bodies, conducting heat away more slowly than smaller animals because of the physical properties of scale. The ornithopods are less active, standing in whatever patches of deeper shade they can find. Even the pterosaurs pull back from their midday soaring, settling in the treetops to rest through the hottest hours. The predators are patient. They are always patient. Hunting is most productive in the early morning and late afternoon, when prey is active and the temperature allows sustained physical exertion. During the midday heat, an Allosaurus at rest in the deep shade of a conifer stand is conserving energy, waiting for the temperature to drop enough that a sprint becomes worthwhile again. The afternoon begins to cool around 3 hours before sunset, and the world comes back to life. The herbivores resume feeding with renewed energy, making up the calories lost during the hot middle of the day. The pterosaurs are back in the air, catching the afternoon thermals. The river glitters in the lower angle afternoon light, and a group of sauropods is heading toward it for the evening drink, their footsteps the deep, steady drum of their passage across the floodplain. At the edge of the forest, an Allosaurus is watching. The light begins to fail. The long Jurassic sunset, which at these latitudes in this season lasts perhaps an hour, paints the floodplain in colours that no human eye has ever seen it in, though the colours themselves are universal. Orange, then deep red, then the purple that precedes full dark. The night comes on. The sounds change. The day insects give way to night insects. The larger animals settle. The small coelurosaurs, those feathered, warm-blooded opportunists who can operate in the dark with their relatively high metabolic rates, become active in the forest understory, their quick movements through the leaf litter invisible in the darkness above. The stars come out. Jurassic stars are the same stars we see today, or nearly so. 150 million years of stellar drift has moved them fractionally from where they were in the Jurassic sky, but nothing a naked eye could detect. Orion is there, or nearly there. The Milky Way is there, the same band of light that has been crossing the night sky of Earth for billions of years. Under those stars, in the warm darkness of the Jurassic night, the Morrison floodplain breathes. The river whispers. Somewhere, something very large shifts in its sleep. This is the Jurassic. This is what it was. These ordinary moments, these unremarkable midnights on an ancient floodplain, multiplied by 56 million years, 10,000 generations, 100,000 generations, 1,000,000 generations, each one as real as this one, each one complete in itself, each one now buried in the rocks and the silence of deep time. It was real. All of it was real. And now it is time to sleep. The Jurassic night was never truly silent. This is something worth dwelling on as you rest, because the silence we associate with sleep, the quiet we seek at the end of a long day, is itself a product of the deep past. Our need for quiet, our ability to find rest in it, is an inheritance from animals that retreated into the dark and the stillness to restore themselves, just as every creature has done for as long as creatures have existed. But the Jurassic night had its own sounds, and if you could be transported there, you would find them not threatening but deeply, anciently familiar. The forests of the Jurassic night were full of insects. We have spoken about the extraordinary diversification of insects during the Jurassic, and that diversity expressed itself most fully in the evening and night hours, when the day-active animals rested and the darkness belonged to the smaller, quieter inhabitants of the world. The ancestors of modern crickets were there, producing rhythmic pulses of sound from their wing covers, each species with its own particular cadence, its own particular frequency. The soundscape of the night forest, a complex weave of individual songs that together created something larger than any of them alone. The ancestors of cicadas were there, though the deafening choruses we associate with summer heat were still in the future. The ancestors of many nocturnal beetle species were moving through the leaf litter, their hard wing covers making faint clicking sounds as they navigated the debris of the forest floor. The ancestors of moths were flying in the darkness, their wings silent by necessity, their large eyes gathering the faint light that filtered through the forest canopy. And the predators of the night were there too. Small coelurosaur dinosaurs whose large forward-facing eyes suggest adaptation for low-light vision. Primitive mammals, tiny and furtive, hunting insects with a nervous efficiency that had been refined over millions of years of nocturnal survival. Early lizards, their scales cool in the night air, waiting motionless for the insects that would not see them until it was too late. The night air of the Jurassic was different from our night air in ways that go beyond the sounds. The oxygen content of the atmosphere was somewhat higher than today, making each breath slightly more energizing. The carbon dioxide content was also higher, a product of the warm Jurassic climate, giving the air a faint organic richness that modern lungs would find almost intoxicating. The humidity was high, particularly in the forests near the rivers, and the smell of the night air would have been extraordinary. Wet earth and conifer resin, and the faint, sweet decay of organic matter, and underneath all of that, the vast, ancient smell of a world that was alive in every particle of its soil. The darkness itself was deeper than modern darkness, away from human habitation. There were no artificial lights anywhere on Earth. There had never been artificial lights. The only lights in the Jurassic night were the stars, the moon when it rose, and the occasional flash of bioluminescence from fungi or deep-sea organisms, or the rare bioluminescent insect whose lineage we have not yet traced to the Jurassic with certainty, but which likely existed in some form. The stars of the Jurassic were the same stars we see today, but differently arranged. The constellations we know are the product of the current positions of stars relative to Earth, and those positions have shifted across the 200 million years since the Jurassic. The Jurassic sky was a different configuration of the same stars, the same ancient lights, a slightly different pattern traced across the darkness above the canopy. The Jurassic world rested under those stars every night for 56 million years. Generation after generation of animals whose names we have given them and whose actual voices we will never hear, lay down in the darkness, reduced their metabolisms, lowered their activity levels, and allowed their bodies to do the work of restoration that only rest enables. Sleep, or something very much like it, has been part of the animal experience since long before the Jurassic. The need for rest is built into the fundamental architecture of nervous systems, and nervous systems have been requiring rest since they first evolved. There is something profoundly comforting in that. Your need for rest is not a weakness or an inefficiency. It is one of the oldest and most universal features of animal life. Every dinosaur that ever walked the Jurassic needed rest. Every pterosaur that ever crossed the Jurassic sky needed rest. Every small proto-mammal that ever hunted insects in the Jurassic undergrowth needed rest. The entire Jurassic world, in all its diversity and complexity and strangeness, needed rest. And every night it settled into the ancient practice of allowing its bodies to restore themselves against the demands of the coming day. You are part of that ancient tradition. Your rest tonight is continuous with the rest of every animal that has ever lived. There is nothing unusual about it. There is nothing vulnerable about it. It is as natural and as ancient as breathing, as necessary as food, as fundamental as anything that biology has ever produced. Let the Jurassic rest with you. The giants are lying down in the dark, their enormous bodies finally still after a day of moving through the world. The predators are curled in whatever shelter they have found, their eyes closed, their nervous systems quiet. The small warm things in the undergrowth are tucked into burrows and crevices, their heartbeats slowing, their tiny bodies warm against the cool night air, all of them resting, all of them part of the same ancient process that you are part of now. The living world quieting itself, gathering itself, preparing itself for whatever tomorrow holds. The Jurassic night is long. It stretches across 56 million years of evenings, each one dissolving into the next, each one its own complete experience and also part of something so much larger that no individual evening can contain it. You're having your own evening now, your own small addition to the uncountable evenings that have preceded it, and tomorrow you will rise as the Jurassic rose, refreshed and ready, as all life has always risen from rest. But not yet. Now it is still night. Now the world is quiet and dark and ancient, and everything that is not this moment can wait. The sound of your own breathing is the oldest sound in the world. Life breathing. The world sustaining itself through another moment, another breath, another heartbeat. Rest in that. Rest deeply. The Jurassic is 200 million years in the past, and it is as close as your next breath, built into the biology that is breathing for you even now. Good night from the deep Jurassic. Good night from the ancient world. Good night. The relationship between the Jurassic and the present is not merely scientific. It is personal in a way that is easy to overlook but worth taking time to feel. Every cell in your body contains structures called mitochondria, organelles, that produce the energy that keeps you alive. Those mitochondria are descended from bacteria that were incorporated into larger cells somewhere between 1 and 2 billion years ago. They have been a part of every complex life form since then. They were in the cells of every Jurassic dinosaur. They are in the cells of every living thing today. Your mitochondria and the mitochondria of every bird singing in the morning are the same ancient structures, modified across billions of years of evolution, but recognizably continuous, recognizably the same fundamental machinery of life. This is not poetry. This is molecular biology. The continuity between you and the Jurassic world is real, physical, demonstrable at the level of molecules and cells. When you breathe, you are using biochemical processes that were refined in organisms far more ancient than dinosaurs. When your heart beats, the proteins that cause your heart muscle to contract are versions of proteins that caused the heart muscles of Jurassic animals to contract. When your nervous system processes information, the electrical signals it uses are generated by the same ion channels, the same fundamental electrochemical machinery that generated electrical signals in the nervous systems of every animal since the Cambrian. You're continuous with the deep past in every literal sense. The atoms that make you up have been recycled through the biosphere since long before the Jurassic. The molecules that carry your genetic information are written in the same chemical language as the genetic information of every organism that has ever lived. The cellular machinery that keeps you alive was invented, refined, and maintained through evolutionary continuity that stretches back 3.5 billion years. The Jurassic is not elsewhere. It is not some remote separate thing that can only be accessed through fossils and geochemical analysis. It is here, in the biology of every living thing, in the evolutionary legacy that connects the present to everything that came before. When you look at a bird, you're looking at the Jurassic expressed in a contemporary form. When you feel the tiredness that drives you towards sleep, you are feeling a biological imperative that was already ancient when Allosaurus walked the Morrison floodplain. Rest, then, in the knowledge that you are not separate from that long history. You are its most recent expression. You are what 200 million years of Jurassic evolution and the hundreds of millions of years before that have been working toward. Not in any teleological sense, not as if the deep past was building toward you specifically, but in the sense that you are the current form of something very old, the latest version of a process that has been running without interruption since the first complex organism drew its first breath and found a way to survive long enough to reproduce. The deep past made you. Tonight you rest in it. Tomorrow you will carry it forward into whatever tomorrow holds. That is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything. The Jurassic world is patient. It has been waiting for you to find it for your entire life, and it will be waiting when you return to it, in whatever form that return takes. through a fossil, through a museum, through a film, through a quiet moment of reflection when a bird calls outside your window and you feel the sudden, strange pull of deep time. It will always be there. The deep past is the most permanent thing there is. Rest now. The world is very old and very quiet and very much at peace with its own history. You can be at peace with yours. Good night. The Jurassic taught us something about scale that no other era can quite match. When we speak of 56 million years, we are speaking of a duration so vast that every human framework for understanding time breaks down completely. 1,000,000 years is 1,000 millennia. 1,000 millennia is 1,000 sets of 1,000 years. All of recorded human history, every dynasty and republic and empire, every written word and built monument, every documented human achievement from the first clay tablets of Mesopotamia to this present moment fits many times over into a single million years. The Jurassic contains 56 of those millions, stacked one atop the other, each one complete in itself and together forming something almost too large to hold in the mind. Yet life lived it all. Every one of those 56 million years was experienced by living creatures whose experiences were real in the same sense that yours is real. They felt hunger and satiation. They felt the warmth of sunlight after a cool night. They felt the particular ease of a body at rest. Each one of those uncountable evenings across 56 million years was someone's evening, the close of someone's day, the transition into the ancient animal practice of rest. Tonight is your evening. It is small against the backdrop of the Jurassic, but it is no less real for that. It is happening now. The ancient world surrounds it. Sleep finds you here, at the end of your own day, as sleep has always found every living thing at the end of every day since days first existed. Let it find you now. Good night. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one.